I died saving someone, expecting a second chance at life, but instead, I woke up in a world where I wasn't the hero of the story. I was the meal. In a land ruled by powerful monster girls, humans like me are rare, valuable, and dangerously appetizing, which means every encounter could be my last. If I want to survive, I'll have to do the impossible. Convince the deadliest predator in the room not to eat me, and maybe even make her my ally. Could I survive on this world as a meal? First, don't forget to like and subscribe, and then let's jump into my story. I called out into the void, my voice disappearing into nothingness, as if it had never existed in the first place. This had to be a coma. I had been here for so long that I lost any sense of time, and even though I had never heard of a coma like this, I couldn't think of anything else it could be. One moment, I had been standing at a bus stop, waiting like any other ordinary day, and the next, I had thrown myself in front of a truck to push a kid out of its path. And now, I was here. Endless black nothing. No pain, no fear, no sense of time passing. Just waiting. I hadn't heard of any afterlife like this either, which only reinforced the idea that it had to be a coma. Then, a voice came from behind me. It was cold, monotone, and completely indifferent. There was no kindness in it, but no cruelty either. Just a flat, unwavering presence that carried a weight I couldn't ignore. It apologized for taking so long to find me. I turned toward the voice, and the moment I did, I came face to face with something I could only describe as death itself. A massive skeleton, easily 10 feet tall, loomed over me. Hellish fire burned inside its empty eye sockets, and black smoke drifted around it, carrying faint, screaming faces that twisted together like a river forming its robes. In its left hand it held a twisted scythe resting on its shoulder, the handle a long, slender bone topped with a skull, and from that skull's mouth extended a curved obsidian blade. I stared at it, taking everything in, and oddly enough, I didn't feel afraid. I admitted that I probably should have been scared, but I wasn't, and with that, I accepted that the coma theory was no longer an option. It observed that I was handling the news of my death well. I told it that while the news was grim, after months of isolation it was strangely comforting, especially knowing that death apparently wasn't the end. That was when it corrected me, explaining that I had been here far longer than months, and that time flowed differently in a place called Limbo. That immediately caught my attention, and I asked how long it had really been, while also questioning whether it was something like the Grim Reaper or even a god. It cut that thought off immediately, stating that it was not God, but merely an overseer. It warned me that there were others like it who had fallen into arrogance and falsely claimed divinity, and it advised me to be cautious of such beings in whatever came next. I accepted that and told myself to remember it, but what really stuck with me was something else it had said: new life. So I asked directly if that meant I was being reincarnated, and more importantly, if it was into another world. I couldn't help but imagine everything: witches, dragons, princesses, the whole fantasy package. It confirmed it without hesitation. As it spoke, it turned and began walking, and even though there was nothing but void around us, I followed. It explained that because I had been hit by a truck, some kind of law dictated that I would be sent to a new world and reincarnated rather than continuing forward. That stopped me for a moment. I questioned whether getting hit by a truck really triggered reincarnation into another world, because that sounded less like reality and more like an overused trope. It responded simply, saying that art imitates life. I didn't even know how to argue with that. Then I remembered the kid. I asked about him, wondering what had happened after I pushed him out of the way. It told me it couldn't comment on him life directly, but it assured me that I had saved him. If I hadn't acted, he would have died and been reincarnated as a child in a world far too cruel for someone alone. That was enough for me. I felt a quiet sense of relief settle in, and for the first time since all of this started, I was genuinely glad about what I had done. I introduced myself properly, realizing I hadn't done that yet. It returned the courtesy, identifying itself as the overseer of death for the world I was about to be reborn into. After that, I decided to ask the question that mattered most. In stories from my world, people who get reincarnated usually receive some kind of overpowered ability, so I asked what I would get. The answer was immediate: nothing. It told me I was quite average, though it added that because I had spent so much time in Limbo, where souls normally rest between lives, my time being lost there had slightly improved my vitality. I paused, trying to process that, and then asked if that meant I was at least strong or hard to kill. Instead of answering directly, it turned toward me and leveled its scythe. The skull embedded in the weapon seemed to lock onto me, and from that angle, the black blade extending from its mouth looked disturbingly like a tongue. It felt like it was mocking me, silently laughing at the idea that I could ever defy something like death. Then it answered. 2 strikes would be enough to kill me, and the second would be a mercy. I let that sink in before admitting to myself that I really wasn't anything special. It turned away again and continued walking, stating that I was still better than most, but that all mortals eventually meet death. I couldn't help but wonder if that meant I had any chance at all of becoming a hero. It told me it didn't know, as that wasn't within its vision, but it did say that being average didn't disqualify me from that possibility. That was enough to spark a bit of hope. So I pushed further, asking if there was something like an adventurer's guild I could join. It told me that when I arrived, I would find myself in a forest east of a city called Jafhe, and that if I wanted to live a life different from my previous one, there was a monster hunting guild there. Then it gave me one final piece of advice: find the deadliest person there. Not long after that, it stopped walking. Even though the surroundings hadn't changed at all, I somehow understood that we had reached the end. So this was where we parted ways. I told it that I wished it well, even if I wasn't entirely sure how appropriate that was. And I thanked it, because regardless of everything, I owed it more than I could really put into words. Then, acting on instinct, I held out my hand. For a moment, it just looked at me, as if deciding whether or not I was worth acknowledging. Then, with something that felt like a quiet sigh, it reached out and took my hand. Its touch wasn't cold like I expected, nor was it burning. It was warm. It felt like the gentler version of death that people spoke about in stories. In that moment, I could sense 3 different aspects coexisting within it. The indifferent voice, the cruel scythe, and the strangely comforting guide. It told me farewell, and it added that I should do my best to avoid it, because it hoped we wouldn't meet again for a long time. Then, in an instant, everything changed. Light flooded my vision as the sun blinded me. Wind brushed against my skin, and the scent of flowers filled the air. I could hear the sounds of nature all around me. Just like that, I had been reborn into a new world. I walked through the city streets, my eyes constantly drifting from the architecture to the wide assortment of demi-humans moving around me. When I had first arrived in the forest, there had been a skeleton nearby with an oddly well-preserved backpack. Inside, I found clothes that fit me perfectly, and I quickly understood it as a parting gift from the overseer, something meant to help me blend in. So this is the city. It looked exactly like what I would have expected from a fantasy medieval setting, with horse-drawn carriages rolling along stone roads, sturdy houses built from rock and timber, different races walking side by side, and a castle standing tall in the distance, on elevated ground. Following the directions the guards had given me, I eventually reached an intersection and glanced up at the signs overhead. The symbols were completely unfamiliar, made up of shapes in different sizes and orientations, clearly the alphabet of this world. I couldn't help but wish I could read. Even so, I kept going, doing my best to navigate by matching symbols and remembering the guards' instructions. After a bit of trial and error, a large 3-story building finally came into view. 2 griffin statues stood at the entrance. In between them hung a heavy sign carved with the same unreadable symbols, which I assumed was the guild's name. The moment I stepped inside, the foyer opened into a massive space that stretched up to the 2nd floor. A railed gallery wrapped around 3 sides above, connecting rooms while overlooking everything below. A wide staircase split the hall down the middle, dividing the building into 2 distinct wings. To the right, there was a lively restaurant filled with movement, food being carried, drinks being served, and waitresses weaving through the crowd. To the left, the atmosphere shifted entirely. A wall was covered in papers that looked like job postings. Benches were arranged in the center, and a row of reception counters lined the far wall. There were people scattered throughout, wizards in robes, knights in armor, and others who carried themselves with quiet danger. Any one of them would have stood out back in my old world, but here, they all felt like part of the norm. So this is the Monster Hunting Guild. It really does feel like something straight out of an anime or an MMO, and everyone here looks like they belong in a fight, which just makes it harder to figure out who the deadliest person is supposed to be. I moved deeper into the restaurant, scanning the room carefully, and that was when I noticed her. She sat in the back corner, partially hidden from view. She was petite with a slim but athletic build, her figure balancing softness with lean muscle and the faint outline of abs. Her outfit was simple and flexible. A cropped tube top, fishnet sleeves, and loose pants. Her long black hair was tied into a high ponytail, with angled bangs and loose strands framing her face. She was undeniably attractive, but not fragile. Her pale skin and sharp features reminded me of moonlight reflecting off steel, and her vivid green eyes stood out against the contrast. Even without seeing any weapons, I could tell she was some kind of ninja, or at least, this world's version of one. She looked closer to a waitress than the other hunters around her, but despite that, there was something about her presence that felt dangerous. There was no doubt in my mind. I walked over and sat down at her table, and before I could even say anything, she spoke without looking up. Her tone was cold and dismissive as she asked what I wanted and called me a farm boy. I froze for a moment, caught completely off guard. I had always been more on the introverted side, and approaching a stranger like this, especially a girl, wasn't something I was used to. So this is how it starts, I thought to myself. I couldn't exactly tell her I had been reincarnated, and there was no way I could mention that death had sent me here. I introduced myself as Leon and awkwardly asked what made her think I was a farmer. She answered simply that she could tell. That only made me more confused, so I asked how. At that, she set her food down and looked directly into my eyes. Her expression stayed stern, and there was a sharp intensity behind her gaze. She explained her reasoning in a calm but cutting way. My size suggested I had consistent access to food, but my muscles showed I still did physical labor. My clothes were clean and well kept, but without any signs of wealth. And most importantly, the way I had entered the building, looking around uncertainly, too hesitant to approach the others, until I settled on her because she appeared less intimidating. It was thorough, almost uncomfortably accurate. I realized I might have hit a nerve somewhere, but at the same time, her analysis made sense. Back in my old world, I was just average, but here, even something like consistent access to food seemed like a privilege. And if she really was some kind of assassin, then reading people like this was probably second nature to her. At the very least, I noted that I could probably pass as a farmer's son if I needed to. Still, lying didn't feel like the right move here. The overseer's words echoed in my mind, steadying me. Find the deadliest person. so I decided to be honest. I told her I wasn't from a farm and that I had only visited one a few times, and then I explained that the reason I approached her wasn't because I thought she was weak, but because I had a feeling she was the deadliest person in the room. I could see a subtle shift in her reaction. She seemed pleased, even if she tried to hide it behind a hardened expression and a probing stare. She asked if someone had put me up to this. I admitted that, in a way, yes, I had come here to join the guild and become a hunter, but I had no idea how any of it worked. As she had already figured out, I was completely lost, and to make matters worse, I had no money and couldn't read. As soon as I said it, I felt the weight of how it sounded. First interaction in a new world, and I had already introduced myself as lost, broke, and clueless. Not exactly a strong first impression. Still, I pressed on, making it clear that I wasn't joking. I told her I had been instructed to find the deadliest person there, and after looking around, I believed that was her. She asked who had told me that, and I answered, a bit awkwardly, that it was Def. For a brief moment, I braced myself, half expecting things to go very badly. Instead, she leaned back slightly, her expression softening into something more neutral, as if I had genuinely caught her interest. She explained that she had been trained to analyze people, and based on that, I was either foolish, unstable, or an exceptionally good liar. Still, she decided to humor me and ask what I actually knew about hunters. That alone felt like a small victory. I gathered my thoughts and admitted that my understanding was pretty basic. Hunters took jobs to kill monsters, they used magic, and they went on adventures at least sometimes. Saying it out loud made me realize how little I actually knew. She followed up by asking if I knew my attributes or abilities. I admitted that I didn't, and that I wasn't even sure what those were. That earned a small smirk from her, like she found the situation amusing. She leaned forward slightly, clearly more engaged now. She told me I really was as inexperienced as I seemed, and explained that the guild used something called crystalline dice to measure attributes. There was a fee to use them, and if my total was high enough, I would be allowed to join. After that, I would need to pay both the sign-up fee and the first year's membership fee. I asked if that process was handled on the other side of the building, and she confirmed it. Then, since I couldn't read, she offered to point me to the right desk. She also pointed out that I had no money, and while she could cover the cost for me, I would owe her a favor in return. Her tone shifted slightly when she said that, carrying a hint of something playful but also unmistakably dangerous. It felt almost like she enjoyed the idea of having leverage, even as it served as a quiet warning. I found myself wondering if that counted as flirting, but it felt far more like a calculated risk than anything lighthearted. She was reading me completely, and I didn't really have anything to bargain with. Still, I had already decided to be straightforward with her, so there was no point in backing out now. I told her that was fine with me. For a brief moment, surprise crossed her face before her expression returned to neutral. She commented that I was unusual and admitted that she didn't normally go out of her way to help people, but she would make an exception this time. With that, she stood up and started walking toward the left wing of the building, and I followed. As we moved, I realized there was one thing I hadn't asked yet, so I mentioned that I hadn't gotten her name. She answered simply, Rika. I followed Rika into the left wing of the guild hall, where a receptionist stood behind one of the counters. Rika spoke first, explaining that I was there to have my attributes and abilities checked, and that she would be covering the cost while observing. The receptionist acknowledged it and gestured for us to follow. We were led into a back hallway, and through one of the doors was a private room with a large table at its center. Shelves and bookcases lined the walls, filled with boxes that the receptionist began opening. From them, she pulled out what looked like dice, 3 with 8 sides and 12 with 12 sides, each in a different color. Rika explained that these were crystalline dice, and she pointed out that the 3 diamond-shaped ones were for attributes, mana, chi, and essence, while the 12-rounder ones represented abilities like strength and intelligence. I asked about the difference between mana, chi, and essence, trying to keep up with everything. She explained that chi was energy drawn from the body and used to enhance it, which was what she specialized in. Mana and essence were similar in concept, but since she didn't have those attributes herself, she didn't go into detail. She only mentioned that mana came from the mind, while essence came from the soul. That raised another question, so I asked if it was possible to have multiple attributes. She confirmed that it was, and added that depending on which ones you had and how much, it would influence the kind of fighting style you could pursue. Abilities mattered too, but they were easier to train, whereas attributes were more foundational. As long as you didn't have 0 attributes, you could improve. That word stuck with me. 0. I asked if that was common, and she responded with a mischievous tone, clearly enjoying the situation as she read my reaction effortlessly. She told me it was more common than not. The receptionist handed me all 15 dice, so it was possible to have no attributes at all. The overseer had said I was average, which I had assumed applied to abilities, but now I wasn't so sure. At the very least, I hoped for something. Anything. I told myself this was the moment of truth and rolled the dice across the table. They bounced and spun, each glowing in its own color before settling into place. My attributes and abilities had been decided. I focused first on the 3 8-sided dice. The blue one landed on 0. I shifted to the red one, also 0, then the green one, 0 again. My heart sank as I stared at the results. So that was it. No attributes at all. The overseer had said I had a chance, but what kind of chance did I have with nothing to work with? Rika suddenly laughed, openly amused, before composing herself and telling me not to look so defeated just yet. She pointed me toward another die on the table. On the other side, she and the receptionist were both looking at a gold-colored die that had landed on 12. The maximum value. That caught my attention immediately. If that was the highest possible result, then it had to mean something good. I asked what ability it corresponded to. Instead of answering directly, Rika poked my chest and explained that the gold die represented vitality. Everything else about me was average, but in her words, I would make an excellent punching bag. Then, almost casually, she asked if she could test that by stabbing me. I barely had time to process that before reacting in confusion. Before things could escalate further, the receptionist cleared her throat and stepped in, listing my results formally. I had 0 in all attributes and average in all abilities, with the exceptions being slightly above average intelligence and an unconfirmed vitality. She excused herself to retrieve a larger die. As she left, Rika turned back to me, clearly puzzled. She questioned how my intelligence had reached 8, especially considering that I couldn't read. I admitted that I had been a student in my previous life, which seemed to surprise her. Then I redirected the conversation, asking about the punching bag comment and why the receptionist needed another die. Rika explained that abilities for humans typically ranged from 1 to 10, and while attributes could temporarily boost them during combat, 10 was considered the natural limit. Those who exceeded their racial limits were often referred to as heroes. That made me pause. I asked if that meant I was a hero. She dismissed the idea immediately, explaining that heroes usually had most of their abilities above 10, along with attributes. In contrast, I had no attributes, and only average abilities. When everything was combined, I was still about 20 points short of qualifying for the guild. To make up for that gap, my vitality would need to reach at least 32, which she compared to something on the level of dragons. That led me to another question. I asked what vitality actually represented, because even if it was health, the idea of a dragon only having 6 times the vitality of a human didn't seem right. She clarified that the scale wasn't linear. The gap between each number increased as the value rose, meaning the difference between 5 and 6 was smaller than between 6 and 7, and so on. As for what vitality itself meant, she described it as overall health, recovery, stamina, resistance to illness, and similar factors. So essentially, I was just a normal person with an unusually large health pool. The overseer had mentioned that I had spent too long in Limbo, which probably explained why this was the one area where I stood out. The receptionist returned carrying a tray, and at its center was a gold 20-sided die. She told me to roll whenever I was ready. Another moment of truth. I needed that die to land on 20 so I could move up to the next tier. In games, there were plenty of characters who used their health as a resource instead of mana, so if I could get into the guild, maybe I could find a way to do something similar. I picked up the die and rolled it across the table. It moved like the others, but the light it emitted was far brighter, almost blinding. When it finally stopped, the glow faded, and I leaned forward to see the result. 20. There was still a chance. Before I could fully celebrate, I felt something press sharply into my side, nearly knocking me off balance. I turned to see Rika leaning into me, pushing a thin metal spike, about 8 inches long, against my body. I reacted immediately, asking what she thought she was doing. She stepped back casually, twirling the spike between her fingers, and explained that something strange was happening. She could pierce my skin, but at the same time, something was pushing her weapon out, as if my body was forcing it away. She noted that I didn't have chi, so I shouldn't have been able to use any kind of regeneration skill. Even so, I told her not to casually test things like that on me. She just smiled and reminded me that she had asked earlier, adding that she was simply curious. From her perspective, having such high vitality alongside otherwise normal abilities was unusual. She mentioned that while she could physically push me off balance, she couldn't actually harm me in any serious way, reinforcing her earlier point that I really was a punching bag. The receptionist cleared her throat again, drawing our attention. She explained that she would need to inform the guild master about my results, and that he would likely arrive in the afternoon to continue testing. In the meantime, she asked me to wait either nearby or in the guild hall. She then led us out of the room and back into the main foyer before giving a polite bow and leaving. Rika watched her go, then turned back to me, admitting that she had been curious about my results, and that I had exceeded her expectations. Not bad for someone she had initially written off as a farm boy. I asked if she was leaving. She confirmed that she had to go, explaining that she and her party had an important raid that night and that she had only come to the guild to pick up supplies and get lunch. Before parting, she advised me to be careful and not to trust others so easily. She also told me to share my results with her when she returned. She smiled once more before turning and walking away. I sat down on one of the benches in the center of the left wing and watched her leave, taking a moment to reflect. Rika gave off an undeniably dangerous presence, but once I got her talking, she was surprisingly approachable. She had tested my durability in a way that could have gone badly, but it hadn't felt malicious. For a first friend in a new world, she wasn't a bad outcome, and if I was being honest, she was also very attractive. I couldn't help but think back to the Overseer of Death, and quietly appreciate the situation. When I arrived at the guild hall again, it was already around lunchtime. A few hours had passed since the test, and the earlier crowd had come and gone. Now, a different wave of people was beginning to filter in for dinner, and it was during that lull that a receptionist approached and called for me. She thanked me for my patience and asked me to follow her. I did, walking once more through the back hallway, passing the same room where I had rolled the dice earlier, and continuing all the way to the end of the corridor. She knocked on a door, then opened it and gestured for me to step inside. The room beyond was the guildmaster's office. A large wooden desk dominated the space, with bookshelves lining the walls and wide windows stretching across the far side, letting in a soft, steady light. Sitting behind the desk was an older man, completely bald, with a long white beard that reached his chest. His face was marked with deep lines, but his eyes were sharp and calm, carrying a quiet authority. He wore simple, faded gray robes that looked more suited to a monastery than an office. And despite his age, his body appeared disciplined, as if shaped by years of training and meditation. An old monk, now serving as the guild master. He didn't carry the same obvious sense of danger as Rika, but there was a steady, grounded intensity about him. I introduced myself and explained that I was there because I had rolled a 20 on the gold die. He invited me to sit and introduced himself as Nadu, the master of Jafe's Hunters Guild. His voice was calm and deliberate, each word measured, as though he had no need to rush. He said he had already heard a bit about me, listing things in a way that made it clear word had spread quickly. A newcomer from the countryside, likely my first time in a city, no attributes, average abilities, but a vitality at the level of a hero. He even mentioned that I had managed to befriend Rika and get her to cover my fees, which he found more surprising than my test results. I admitted that I hadn't realized she had that kind of reputation, and explained that I had approached her simply because she seemed strong. He acknowledged that she was, explaining that Rika belonged to one of the guild's top 5 parties, an all-female group called Rosethorns, and that she was particularly hostile toward men. That, more than anything, was what made my situation unusual in his eyes. Then he shifted back to my abilities. He explained that having a single ability above 20 was rare, but when it did happen, it usually didn't lead to anything remarkable. People like that often became civilians who excelled in specific fields, scholars with high intelligence or performers with high charisma, but still lived relatively normal lives. Vitality, while useful, wasn't tied to any particular profession. I asked what he meant by that, because I hadn't come this far just to be told it didn't matter. He agreed that there was more to discuss, but first he wanted to confirm my vitality. Only after that would we talk about what I could actually do, assuming I passed. He reached beneath his desk and pulled out a strange cylindrical die. Its ends were shaped like pentagonal pyramids, while its sides were made up of triangles and diamond shapes, forming a structure that felt oddly perfect, even in a world already filled with magic. He explained that this was a special die, one that could only be used once. When rolled, it would split into 2, one showing the tens place and the other the ones. Then he told me to go ahead whenever I was ready, so it came down to this again. Another roll, another moment that would decide everything. I needed at least a 32 to qualify. Just the level of a dragon's health. No pressure. I rolled the die. The moment it struck the table, it cracked apart, splitting into 2 pieces that exploded with blinding light. Compared to the earlier dice, this was on an entirely different level. I instinctively raised my arms to shield my eyes, wincing as the brightness flooded the room. After a moment, the light faded. I blinked away the lingering glare and leaned forward to see the result. 0. 0. I froze, staring at the numbers, unable to process what I was seeing. 0. That didn't make any sense. Shouldn't I have gotten at least 20? Or was 20 just the minimum? Did that mean a 1 would have been 21? My thoughts spiraled as I tried to make sense of it. Then Nadu spoke, almost under his breath, noting that it was an actual 100. That snapped me out of it. I looked at him, trying to confirm what I had just heard. He explained that while it was technically undetermined, there likely wasn't a die large enough to measure beyond this. As far as he knew, nothing existed with an ability reaching 100. So those 3 zeros meant 100. For a moment, that felt incredible. But his tone shifted immediately, growing heavier. He told me that it was actually very bad. There were creatures in this world that fed on human vitality. Vampires, liches, banshees, and others. And to them, I would be like a feast, a walking source of immense power. And with everything else about me being so average, I wouldn't be able to defend myself. I would be easy prey. He added that there had already been recent reports of vampire and succubus attacks within the city. Then he stood up, his gaze sharpening. He admitted that, truthfully, eliminating me now would be the safest option, before something worse found me. I stopped him immediately, pointing out that I had been asking from the beginning about turning my vitality into power. If monsters could do it, then there had to be a way for me to do it too, and that would at least give me a chance to protect myself. He paused, then admitted that he wasn't going to act on that thought. Not only because he was uncertain if he even could, given the absurdity of my vitality, but also because he was required to accept my application. Technically, I met the requirements to join the guild. Still, he made it clear he wasn't pleased about it. After a moment, he sat back down. He confirmed that it was possible to convert vitality into power, but explained that such methods were typically known only to those who practiced darker arts. Even then, those individuals usually drew life force from others rather than using their own. If I wanted to learn, I would have to seek out someone like that, which came with obvious risks, since they might see me as more valuable as a resource than a person. That made sense, even if I didn't like it. As things stood, I was more useful to monsters than I was to myself. So, I asked what came next. He told me, somewhat reluctantly, that I was now officially a hunter. I could return the next day to receive my guild card, and I would start at the lowest rank, Tier 5. The rest of the details would be explained then. More importantly, he stressed that I needed to keep my situation a secret, for both my safety and everyone else's. He mentioned that he would reach out to some of the more questionable hunters in the guild to see if any of them had knowledge that could help me make use of my condition. I accepted that. So this was it. I was a hunter now. Even if the introduction had been a bit intense, I found myself looking forward to what came next. There was a quiet excitement building in my chest. A lot had happened in a single day, but for the first time it felt real. My new life had finally begun. I stood in the city square beside the guild, watching as the sun slowly dipped below the horizon. I had nowhere to stay, and since arriving in this new world, I hadn't eaten or slept once. Tonight, and probably a few more nights, I would be out on the streets. I could eat if I wanted to, but I didn't feel any real need to. The same went for sleep. That raised a quiet, unsettling question in my mind. Did I not need them anymore? And if that was the case, could I even starve to death? I began pacing as I thought it through, trying to make sense of my situation. How much could I actually heal through? Rika had said I didn't have any regeneration skills, but when she tested me with that needle, my body had pushed it out on its own through healing. That suggested something deeper. Maybe basic human healing scaled with vitality. That would explain what I experienced. But then that brought me back to the original question. Could I out-heal starvation? It should have been impossible. Food was a resource, something the body needed to function. And yet, I didn't feel hunger at all. I glanced around the square. People were heading home, most of them human, with the occasional demi-human mixed in. The city was settling into the night. I ended up speaking my thoughts out loud, more to organize them than anything else. I decided I should still eat and sleep whenever possible, because even if I didn't need them, I didn't want to lose what made me human. For now, I would rely on my vitality until I found a way to properly establish myself. With that settled, I started walking through the city, partly to pass time, and partly to find somewhere to rest. A bench, a quiet corner, anything that would get me through the night. I wasn't planning on sleeping, but resting still felt worthwhile. As I moved through the streets, I made a habit of returning to the guild square every so often, using it as a reference point since I couldn't read the local signs. If I hadn't been doing that, I might not have noticed the person following me. They were completely cloaked in black, hood pulled low, no visible features at all. By the 7th time I circled back through a small square, I had already accepted that I was being followed. I wondered what they thought of me at this point. I clearly wasn't going anywhere, but I wasn't exactly trying to shake them either. I briefly considered just stopping out in the open and confronting it. Then a loud thud broke my train of thought. I turned immediately, ready for a fight, only to see the cloaked figure lying face first on the ground behind me. I paused. I could have walked away, just kept moving and pretended I hadn't seen anything. No one would have known. But instead, I found myself lifting them and dragging them into a nearby alley, out of the main road. I propped them up against a wall and pulled back the hood. What I found was a girl. Her skin was pale and smooth, her face delicate and unblemished. Her dark red hair was long and jagged, spiking outward like barbed wire. Her figure was striking, with a narrow waist and a balanced, full silhouette that stood out even beneath her clothing. She wore a short black dress in a Victorian style, elegant yet rebellious, decorated with chains and leather straps. Thigh-high boots, a choker, and multiple ear piercings completed the look, blending gothic refinement with something more defiant. She didn't look like she was from around here, and while she appeared human at first glance, that shade of red hair didn't seem natural. Then again, I had already seen enough variety in this world to know that appearances could be deceiving. My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her stomach growling. That immediately reminded me of what Nadu had said about recent vampire attacks. Could she be one? The pale skin, the red hair, it fit. Maybe she had passed out from hunger. Maybe she had been unable to find anyone to feed on. Or maybe I was overthinking it. Curiosity got the better of me. I crouched down and gently touched her face, then carefully parted her lips with my thumb. That was when I saw them. 4 fangs where her canine should have been. Long, sharp, and slightly curved inward. Not just for piercing, but for holding. Strangely enough, they looked almost delicate in their own dangerous way. I leaned in a little closer to examine them, even though I was fully aware of how questionable the situation looked. Then my finger lingered too long. A small cut. A drop of blood fell onto her tongue. I reacted instantly, but before I could pull away, her hands shot up and grabbed my arm. She was smaller than me, her fingers unable to fully wrap around my forearm, yet her grip held me in place. Her eyes fluttered open slightly, revealing a faint amber glow, and she began to feed. Her movements were slow at first, almost instinctive, as she drew in the blood. There was a strange intensity to it, a focus that made it clear she was completely absorbed in the act. My thoughts spiraled. Why was she reacting like that? Her body shifted subtly, her breathing uneven as she continued, and the entire situation felt far more intimate than I was prepared for. I couldn't make sense of it. Was she feeding, or something else? My mind struggled to process it, and my body refused to move. The closeness, the unfamiliar sensation, it was overwhelming in a way I had never experienced before. I forced myself to steady my thoughts. This was dangerous. I needed to stay focused. Time passed, longer than I expected, nearly 2 minutes before the bleeding finally stopped. That raised another question. Had my wound healed, and why had it taken that long? Did her saliva interfere with healing? If my vitality hadn't been this high, how bad would that have been? Eventually, her movements slowed. She drew back slightly, licking away the last traces before releasing me. A soft exhale escaped her, followed by a small, almost embarrassed sound. Then her eyes sharpened. Reality seemed to hit her all at once. She jerked upright, pressing herself back against the wall as her grip loosened completely. She looked at me in disbelief, clearly shaken by what had just happened, struggling to process the fact that she had fed from a human, and that I was still standing in front of her. I gave a small, uncertain greeting, raising my hand slightly. She stared, then glanced down at my finger, still marked by what had just happened. Her face flushed deeply. She began trying to explain herself in a rush, insisting that she had only been hungry, that it had been a long time, and that she had been starving. I listened, trying to piece together what that meant. A vampire that didn't normally feed on humans. That alone was unusual. But more importantly, vampires used blood as a source of power, and that meant this was an opportunity. I interrupted gently, acknowledging what she was, but then asked if she could teach me blood magic. Everything stopped. Her expression shifted instantly, her eyes narrowing as she focused entirely on me. The air grew tense, and a dagger formed in her hand, dark and fluid, like solidified blood. I realized immediately that I had moved too fast. She had been shocked that I survived. Combined with how her saliva slowed my healing, it was clear that feeding usually ended differently for her victims. And I had just asked her to teach me that. I quickly told her to wait and let me explain. She had already begun to rise, the dagger positioned between us. I pointed out that she had just fed on me and that I could have died, so it was only fair she at least hear me out. She countered immediately, arguing that I had been the one to put my finger in her mouth while she was unconscious, and that any consequences would have been my own fault. That was fair. Still, I explained that I wouldn't have died, and considering she had been following me and collapsed from hunger, I had effectively helped her. That made things even. She hesitated. I could see her considering it. She had been starving, and despite everything, I had given her blood, and survived. Finally, she agreed to hear me out, though she made it clear that she didn't owe me anything. I let out a quiet breath of relief as the tension eased slightly. Then I explained. I told her I had no intention of using other people's blood, and that if she taught me, I would only ever use my own. In exchange, she could continue feeding from me. Her expression shifted again, this time from guarded to confused. That was progress. I decided to introduce myself properly. I told her my name was Leon. After a brief pause, she gave hers. Valeria, I explained my situation as clearly as I could, keeping it simple so I wouldn't lose her unnecessary details. I told her I wanted to become a hunter, but I had no affinity for chi, magic, or essence, and all I really had was an overwhelming amount of vitality. So if she could teach me how to use that vitality for blood magic, it would solve everything. I could feel my own excitement as I said it, but Valeria just stared at me, completely stunned. She questioned how I could be so calm about everything. I didn't immediately understand what she meant, so I asked her to clarify. That only seemed to frustrate her more, as she pointed out the obvious. I was talking to a vampire who had just fed on me, and instead of reacting with fear, anger, or even basic caution, I was acting like it was normal. From my perspective, though, it really did feel like something out of a story. I straightened slightly and raised my hands, adding a bit of dramatic flair as I described it. A beautiful vampire, starving because she refused to harm humans, finally reaching her limit, only to meet someone she could feed from without causing harm. Then I dropped the theatrics, still smiling as I returned to a more grounded tone. On a practical level, it worked out perfectly. She could feed without guilt, and I could learn blood magic. It was a fair exchange. She called me unreasonable, clearly unsure how to process me at all. Even so, I could see hesitation in her expression, mixed with something else. The fact that she could feed safely from me, and that she had already experienced it, clearly affected her. She admitted she needed time to think, and asked me to tell her more about myself. That caught me off guard for a moment, but I didn't mind. If anything, I found it a little endearing how cautious she still was, even though she was more than capable of overpowering me if she wanted. I sat down against the wall, settling into a more relaxed posture. I started with the basics, explaining that I had arrived in the city that very morning, and since I had no money, I had just been walking around in circles to pass the time and get through the night. She sat down as well, keeping a small distance between us, listening quietly. I continued, mentioning that before this, I had been at the Hunter's Guild. I had technically passed the exam, which meant I was now a hunter, but without any attributes. I was still essentially just human. She picked up on that immediately, connecting it back to what I had said earlier about my vitality. She understood that my score must have been high enough to carry me through the test, and she seemed surprised that there was no strict requirement for attributes. I told her it surprised me too, but apparently, it was allowed. And as she could see, my vitality was high enough to keep me alive even after what had just happened. She observed that I did seem unusually energetic, and asked if I felt tired at all. I answered honestly that I didn't. From there, she summarized my situation in her own words. With no attributes, my only real path forward was to learn blood arts and use my own vitality as a resource. I repeated the term quietly to myself, letting it settle. Then I added that I hadn't originally been thinking specifically of vampires when I considered this path. In fact, the guildmaster had warned me to avoid creatures like vampires since they could use my vitality for themselves. She pointed out, almost dryly, that she had followed me in the middle of the night anyway. I acknowledged that, noting that she was now fully up to speed. After a brief pause, she shifted the conversation again, asking about my life before today. That was a problem. I couldn't exactly tell her I was from another world, especially when she was already uncertain about trusting me. So I defaulted to something safe, listing small, ordinary things about myself. My favorite color, the kinds of food I liked. Even as I said it, I could tell how awkward it sounded. It felt like one of those forced introductions on the first day of school. She tilted her head slightly, clearly unimpressed, and pointed out that it wasn't what she meant. I admitted that I didn't know what else to say and asked if there was something more specific she wanted to know. She explained that it wasn't about being interesting, but about understanding who she was dealing with. She mentioned that she wasn't exactly welcome anywhere and hadn't had a friendly interaction in a long time. That shifted the tone. I let out a quiet breath, realizing I had been approaching this too lightly. I admitted that I understood her caution, and at the same time, I found it strange how little caution I was showing myself. The guildmaster had described me as something that monsters would seek out, and yet here I was, speaking with confidence in a situation that should have been far more dangerous. It didn't match who I used to be. I had always been quiet, reserved, someone who avoided standing out. But now, I was acting differently. I paused, thinking it through as I spoke. I told her that I had recently come close to death, and now I was here, alone in a completely new place with nothing tying me down. No family, no home, nothing to return to. And because of that, something had shifted. I felt lighter, in a way. Less afraid, not fearless exactly, but different enough that even I was still trying to understand it. She listened carefully, and I could see that something in what I said resonated with her. She commented that my situation sounded just as difficult as hers, maybe even worse, yet I was handling it surprisingly well. I had a brief moment of concern, wondering if that came across the wrong way, but before I could respond, she muttered something under her breath. Fateful encounter. Then she straightened, her expression firming into something more decisive. She agreed to the deal. She stated it clearly, almost formally, that I would become her source of food, and in return, she would teach me blood arts. That was all I needed to hear. I stood up immediately, unable to hide my excitement as I asked when we would start and what I needed to do, already eager to begin. She quickly told me to calm down, reminding me that this wasn't something I should be announcing out loud. If word got out, I would be targeted before I even had a chance to establish myself. As she said that, I noticed movement at the edges of the alley. 2 cloaked figures had appeared, one at each end, effectively cutting off any way out. I couldn't help but comment on the timing. Valeria stood up beside me, shifting into a defensive stance as she formed the same crimson dagger in her hand. She clarified that they weren't after me, but after her. These were assassins who had been tracking her. As I watched, blood began to flow from their hands, rising into the air and shaping itself into weapons. The liquid twisted and condensed into thin, elegant blades, rapiers made entirely of crimson, with fluid handles that continued to move like living streams. So these were the ones behind the recent attacks. While Valeria had been starving herself and running, they had been feeding freely. I raised my fists instinctively, settling into a stance as I prepared myself. It seemed my first lesson was about to begin. Valeria shut the idea down immediately, saying there would be no lesson, not here, not now, and that I was still just a human while she couldn't take both of them on. We needed to escape. I stood back to back with her as the 2 vampire assassins closed in, each cloaked in dark robes and wielding a crimson rapier formed from their own blood. I pointed out that escape wasn't exactly simple when both exits were blocked. Even as I spoke, I kept observing. Valeria's dagger was made of solidified blood, but theirs was different. The handles and guards still flowed like liquid. That suggested a more advanced technique, or maybe just a greater supply of blood to manipulate. Either way, I didn't have enough information to fully understand it. I forced myself to focus. If we couldn't win, then we had to break through. I asked her if she had any mobility options. Wall running, flight, anything. But she admitted she didn't have enough blood left. And with me there, the situation was worse. Her voice carried a hint of panic. That wasn't good. Before I could respond, the assassins attacked. They thrust their rapiers even from a distance, and as they did, the blades extended, more hardened blood forming along the weapon, increasing both reach and speed. I reacted instantly, warning her and shoving her aside. The attack struck me instead. Both blades pierced into me, but only a few inches before bending and shattering. Fragments of crimson scattered outward, still carrying the force of the impact. They hadn't realized what had just happened. My healing had limited the depth of the wounds, and because the attacks came from opposite directions, their momentum had canceled out, causing the blades to break apart violently. The moment of shock was all I needed. I grabbed Valeria's hand and ran, pulling her toward the city square. Behind us, the vampires were already reforming their weapons. As I moved, a thought clicked into place. They didn't feel like true assassins, more like hired killers. I shifted direction slightly and charged straight toward the one blocking our path, placing myself between him and Valeria as he thrust again. This time, the blade lodged into my chest. Right on cue, the second attack came from behind. Without turning, I pulled Valeria in front of me and held her close, bracing myself as the second strike hit my back. It was stronger than the first, but still not enough to fully overcome my healing. With nothing countering the force this time, we were both sent tumbling out of the alley and into the open square. I hit the ground hard, but I recovered quickly, pushing myself up and helping Valeria to her feet. I mentioned that I had suspected they weren't professionals, and asked if she had a bounty on her. She deflected the question, asking instead what made me think they weren't trained assassins. That was answer enough. I let it go for now. I explained my reasoning anyway. If they were true assassins, they would have attacked from above. or use stealth. Instead, they had blocked exits and relied on direct confrontation. Effective, but not subtle. And after being caught off guard once, they were likely to fall back on the same extended thrust technique. Right on cue, they stepped out of the alley, calmly reforming their weapons and even licking the blades as they approached. I couldn't help but comment on how excessive that was. At the same time, I noted that they had probably realized I had some form of healing, especially since vampires possessed anti-healing properties in their saliva. I kept analyzing. Would they keep using the same attack? It extended their range, but it likely consumed blood. Out here in the open, we had more room to dodge, but they still had the advantage in reach. I glanced behind us and pointed out that the Hunters Guild was nearby and also functioned as an inn, but Valeria immediately rejected the idea. As a vampire, she would be attacked on sight. The two assassins advanced slowly, positioning themselves carefully but not fully surrounding us yet. I considered retreating deeper into the alleys. It would limit their long-range attacks, but if we got trapped in a dead end, we would be finished. There really weren't many options left. I started to say as much. And then it happened. A sudden, heavy impact. Everything slowed. I had hesitated too long. The extended rapier pierced straight through my chest, passing through my heart and out my back. Without my healing bracing against it in time, I could feel just how powerful the attack truly was. My hand moved instinctively, gripping the blade. But even then, I couldn't break it. For a brief moment, a thought crossed my mind. Was this it? Even with everything I had, could I still be taken down in a single strike? Valeria was holding on to me, saying something, but I couldn't hear her. All I could hear was my heartbeat. It wasn't slowing, it was accelerating. Each beat struck like a piston, forceful and relentless, driving something through me. With every pulse, vibrations traveled through the blade like metal clashing against metal. No, I refused to let it end like this. No more hesitation, no more doubt. I didn't have the strength to break the blade, but I had something else. Vitality. I released my grip, clenched my fists, and drew my arms in, tightening every muscle in my body. Then I forced everything forward. My chest flexed, and the blade shattered outward, the break traveling back along it like a chain reaction. My healing surged from within, strongest at my core, overpowering the anti-healing effect, even as the outer wound still bled. I steadied myself, locking eyes with the two vampires as adrenaline surged through me. This wasn't over. I stepped forward, fists clenched, voice steady but sharp as I challenged them, asking if that was the best they could do. That felt incredible. Maybe it was just the adrenaline, but in that moment, I felt unstoppable. Valeria didn't want to head to the Hunters Guild, so running around without direction wasn't going to help. There was only one option left: fight. I told her they were after her, so I would take them head on while she focused on attacking from a distance. She was still shaken from what had just happened. I had taken a hit that should have ended me, and then shattered a blood-formed blade as if it were fragile. Her eyes were still wet, but she forced herself to concentrate. She explained that vampires didn't usually rely on long-range attacks because it consumed too much blood. I told her I would make up for that afterward, and urged her to use everything she had. Then I moved. I sprinted toward the two vampires, and they rushed toward me in response. She tried to call out, but by then it was already too late to hesitate. They were faster. The distance between us vanished almost instantly, and the one whose weapon I had shattered earlier took the lead, charging in with his fists raised. He launched into a high kick aimed at my head. I brought my arms up just in time, but the force still broke through my guard. Without stopping, he landed, spun, and drove a second kick straight into my stomach, sending me crashing to the ground. Before I could recover, the second vampire followed up, leaping over the first and driving his rapier down in a plunging strike that pierced directly through my heart. I reacted without fear this time, pushing through the pain as I flexed my chest again, shattering the blade from within. Then, without wasting a moment, I grabbed one of the shards and drove it into his forearm. At the same time, Valeria moved. She raised her hand toward the sky as blood flowed upward along her arm, defying gravity. Dozens of droplets gathered above her, suspended like glowing red stars. Then she completed her technique. The droplets hardened into sharp spikes before raining down in a wide, fast barrage. They struck the ground in a sweeping wave, piercing through both vampires despite their attempts to evade. As for me, I was still on the ground, completely covered. Instinct had made me shield my face, but the rest of my body was riddled with spikes. So much for avoiding long-range attacks. Valeria collapsed after releasing everything she had into that strike, leaving the rest to me. That wasn't good. The two vampires had already begun recovering. Their ability to heal was clear, though the strain was starting to show. It was wasteful, but undeniably effective. I needed to end this quickly. I pushed myself up and rushed the vampire who had been standing over me earlier. The name came out before I could think of anything better. Porcupine Hug. It was crude, but it fit. Still covered in spikes, I grabbed him and pulled him in tightly. Between the force of the hold and my own healing pushing the spikes outward, they drove deeper into him. He cried out in pain and shoved me away, trying to force his blood to seal the damage, but it was too late. He didn't have enough left, and the bleeding overwhelmed him as he collapsed. That left one. I assessed the situation quickly. If he fed on me, I lost. If he grabbed Valeria and escaped, I lost. If I forced him to retreat, I won. If I took him down, I won. I met his gaze and told him plainly that he was outmatched and that he could leave or face the consequences. My best chance was to make him back off. If he retreated, I could help Valeria recover and prepare for whatever came next. For a moment, it seemed like he might consider it. Then, I saw the resolve in his eyes. He wasn't leaving. He charged again, slower than before but still faster than me. This time he opened with a left hook. I raised my arms to block, but once again the difference in strength broke through. A right uppercut followed, then 2 quick strikes to my nose. Each impact hurt, but the damage vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. At that point, I stopped trying to block. The pain was real, but it didn't matter. Every strike he threw cost him blood, and in a battle of endurance, I wasn't the one who would run out first. I focused on one thing. Eventually, he would try to bite me. That was the one attack I couldn't allow. The barrage continued. Punches, kicks, but they no longer sent me flying. I held my ground, maintaining eye contact, steady and unshaken. Despite everything, I found myself smiling. I stood between him and Valeria, unmoving. When the moment came, I saw it. He set it up with a left uppercut, then drove an elbow into my stomach, positioning himself perfectly to go for my neck. As his fangs came down, I struck first. A clean uppercut snapped his head back, forcing his jaw shut before he could bite. He retreated, putting distance between us. For a moment, I thought he might finally run. Then everything changed. A short blade pierced through his heart from behind, cutting cleanly through his blood burst outward. The weapon looked like a wakizashi, and the force behind it carried through with a sharp gust of wind. The vampire tried to retaliate, swinging backward, but the attacker had already moved. Rika. She balanced effortlessly, using her blade as a pivot point while avoiding his strike. Her movements precise and controlled. As the vampire collapsed, she spoke calmly, as if stating something obvious. Vampires stored their blood in their hearts and could recover from most injuries, even direct strikes to that area. I noticed immediately that Rika wasn't in perfect condition. Her breathing was slightly uneven, and her body carried fresh scars and bruises, signs of whatever she had just come from. Even so, she continued calmly, explaining that since vampires stored their blood in their hearts, targeting that area was the most effective way to drain their reserves. I called out to her, relieved to see her again. She greeted me casually, calling me farm boy as usual, and admitted she was impressed that I had managed to hold my own against 3 vampires. I agreed without hesitation. Then I paused. 3? Before I could fully process that, she stated that she would finish off the girl, saying it was too risky to leave a vampire alive. I stepped in immediately, stopping her and telling her that Valeria was actually my friend. Her entire demeanor changed in an instant. Her eyes locked onto me, and her voice sharpened with anger as she questioned me. She reminded me that she had warned me to be less trusting, and now I had gone and befriended a vampire. I tried to explain, telling her that Valeria was different, that she was vegan. That only made things worse. She questioned what that even meant, and pointed out how easily I had accepted it. From her perspective, it was absurd. I admitted that it sounded strange, but I didn't think Valeria had been lying. She countered immediately, stating that vampires fed on humans, and that deception would be second nature to them. To her, Valeria wasn't just dangerous. She was a monster, something that only looked human. I responded without thinking too much about it, pointing out that Rika herself killed people, yet I trusted her. That caught her off guard. For a brief moment, she froze, and I noticed a faint shift in her expression, a hint of color rising to her cheeks. She dismissed it quickly, though, explaining that it was different. I could trust her because she was herself, but that didn't mean I should trust others so easily, including her. I understood what she was saying, but I didn't back down. I told her that I had felt the same kind of presence from Valeria as I had from her, and that was enough for me. I trusted that instinct. I also explained that Valeria had already agreed to teach me blood arts, and in exchange I would feed her. She seemed to genuinely have an issue with harming humans, which was why she described herself the way she did. Rika paused, then asked if I had already fed her. I confirmed it. Her expression shifted again, this time to something closer to disbelief. I told her I would wake Valeria up so she could evaluate her properly. Then she asked if I had passed the hunter exam. Her tone had softened completely, and there was something else there, something almost apologetic. I told her that I had, that I was officially a hunter now. With that settled, I walked over to Valeria, who was still unconscious. I knew I had to feed her again, but this time Rika was watching. I hesitated for a moment. Surely it wouldn't be the same as before. I knelt down and carefully placed my finger in Valeria's mouth again. Her fangs pierced my skin, and as the blood began to flow, she reacted immediately. Her hands wrapped around my forearm, and she began feeding again with the same intensity as before. Her movements were just as instinctive, her body responding in ways that made the situation feel far more personal than it should have. I could feel Rika's gaze on my back, sharp and unrelenting. She asked if this was the reason I trusted her. Her tone carried more irritation than anger, as if she was holding something back. After what felt like a long stretch of time, Valeria finally opened her eyes. She looked up at me, her expression soft and unfocused, and noted that I had won. Her hand still held my arm, but now her grip was gentle, almost careful. That moment didn't last. Rika moved instantly, striking me in the side with enough force to send me away from Valeria. Before I could recover, she had already positioned herself between us. Her blade pointed directly at Valeria. She demanded to know who she was. I tried to introduce them properly, but Rika ignored me and kept her focus on Valeria. Valeria, to her credit, remained composed. She acknowledged that she would go along with it, recognizing that Rika was someone I trusted, and introduced herself simply as Valeria. Rika pressed further, demanding her full name. Valeria refused, explaining that she had abandoned her family and no longer used that name. That only made Rika more aggressive in her questioning. She asked how much Valeria had taken, what would have happened if she hadn't stopped, whether she could even stop, and whether she had truly been unconscious at all. It was a relentless interrogation. I thought about stepping in, but before I could say anything, Rika cut me off, pointing out that if I trusted Valeria, then I should let her answer. If there was nothing to hide, then there shouldn't be a problem. Despite the pressure, Valeria answered honestly. She admitted she didn't know how much she had taken. She had been unconscious, and to her I had felt like an endless source. If she hadn't stopped, she didn't know what would have happened. Vampires didn't naturally stop. They fed until interrupted or until nothing remained. The only reason she had stopped was because my wound had closed. Her voice remained steady, even though what she was saying clearly wasn't easy for her. Rika didn't ease up. She continued questioning her, asking about her behavior, her intentions, and why she was even in the city. Valeria pushed back slightly, denying any intentional manipulation, and explaining that my blood simply tasted unusually good. She dismissed it lightly, saying she would get used to it eventually. Then she stated her purpose. She had left her family and had been on the run for 2 years, arriving here only a few days ago. As for her name, she reaffirmed that she was simply Valeria, nothing more. Rika studied her for a moment, then finally lowered her blade. She admitted that she still didn't trust her, and that there were more questions to ask, but she didn't have time. She needed me, and she had already delayed too long. She told Valeria to stay put, and made it clear she wouldn't allow her to contact me again until she was satisfied. That caught me off guard. I asked why she needed me. Her expression shifted again, that same hint of guilt returning. She answered simply that she did. I tried to suggest that Valeria could come with us, but Rika refused immediately, saying it was something personal and that Valeria would have to wait. The two of them exchanged tense looks again. Valeria agreed to stay, though she pointed out that she might have questions of her own and that trust went both ways. Rika responded by saying she could already tell Valeria was lying and warned her not to follow. It was clear this wasn't going to resolve on its own, so I stepped between them, cutting through the tension. I suggested that I would go with Rika for now, and afterward we could regroup, maybe over breakfast, and sort everything out. Then I asked how long it would take. She didn't give a clear answer, only saying we should move quickly. Before I could say anything else, she grabbed my hand. As she turned, she met Valeria's gaze one last time, giving her a small, confident smile while still holding on to me. Then she pulled me along, breaking into a run as she led me away from the busy center of the city. As we moved, she spoke again, her voice quieter this time. She asked if I trusted her. Rika led me quickly toward the outer parts of the city, where the dense clusters of buildings gradually gave way to larger homes with wide-open plots of land. As we moved, she asked if I trusted her. I answered that I did, but I couldn't help asking if this was about Valeria, or if it had something to do with the guilt she had been carrying. She muttered that if someone like me could pick up on that, then she was losing her edge. That only made me more curious, so I asked what kind of favor she needed that had been bothering her so much. She paused, clearly thinking it over. Then she said she had originally planned to tell me and give me a chance to back out, but now, considering my new vampire friend, she had changed her mind. She wasn't going to tell me anymore. I stared at her, trying to process that. So she was asking me for a favor while refusing to explain it. I asked why she had suddenly decided not to tell me, and she simply reminded me that I said I trusted her, so I should trust her. I tried asking for at least a hint. She refused. At that point, I couldn't tell if she was upset, annoyed, or something else entirely. Her behavior didn't line up cleanly with anything I could read. Before I could press further, she stopped. We had arrived. In front of us stood a large, ornate manor. A carved stone fence surrounded the property, high enough that only the upper floors were visible from the outside. A heavy metal gate marked the entrance, and beyond it, neatly arranged flower beds lined a circular carriage path leading to the front doors. I couldn't help but react. The place looked impressive. I asked if she lived there. She answered simply that she didn't. Then she pushed the gate open and pulled me inside, closing it behind us, before continuing toward the entrance. I asked again why we were here, but she didn't respond. Inside, the manor was empty. The candles had been extinguished, but faint trails of smoke still rose from them, suggesting whoever had been here had only recently left. Despite that, everything was well maintained. She didn't slow down, pulling me deeper into the building and then down into the basement, still holding my hand as we descended. Before we reached the bottom, I could hear voices, 2 women arguing. One insisted they had no choice, warning that even if the person in question resisted, the king would kill them all. If he found out, the other argued back, saying they couldn't force her, that she had already endured this long, and that they should focus on finding another solution. A third voice added that they were searching through books, but this wasn't something people just casually dealt with. We stepped into the room. There were 3 women inside, all bearing fresh injuries, just like Rika. This had to be her party. Rose Thorns. One was a wizard woman holding a tall wooden staff topped with a glowing blue crystal in her right hand. Another was a blonde in full knight's armor. The last is dressed in forest green clothing with long, wavy reddish-brown hair and pointed ears. Rika announced our arrival, casually mentioning that she had brought along a farm boy. One of them immediately responded that Rika was thinking ahead, implying sacrifices would be necessary. That word caught my attention. Sacrifices. So that was it. She had brought me here because she thought I could survive whatever they were planning. I couldn't help but feel a mix of disbelief and annoyance. The armored knight stepped forward, her expression filled with restrained anger as she confronted Rika. She accused her of letting her personal issues with men influence her decisions, saying that didn't justify sacrificing someone. Rika cut her off quickly, telling her to calm down and clarifying that I wasn't just some random person. She introduced me as a hunter, explained that she had helped me join the guild, and that she had witnessed my test results. Then she described me as completely useless in every aspect except one: my vitality. She said it was at least on a level of a dragon. The knight questioned that. Rika explained that before she left for her raid, I had rolled a 20 in vitality, and since I had no other strengths, I would have needed at least a 32 to pass. The knight turned her attention to me. I hesitated. There was no point hiding it. Rika would find out eventually, and after everything that had already happened, secrecy didn't seem practical. So I told them. I had a vitality of 100. Even then, it wasn't fully confirmed since there wasn't a die large enough to measure beyond that. The room fell silent. That was when it really started to sink in. There was a saying I remembered: 90 was halfway to 100. It was used to illustrate how exponential growth worked, how the gap between values widened more and more, and Rika had already told me that each level increased in difference. So what did 100 actually mean? Trying to make it sound less overwhelming, I added that I should be able to help with whatever problem they were dealing with. The silence didn't lift. Shock, disbelief, doubt, it was all there. Rika was the first to recover, trying to move things forward, but the others immediately interrupted her, rejecting the idea outright. They couldn't accept something like that so easily. Rika pushed back, insisting that I wasn't lying. She reminded them that she had seen my role herself, and that when she came back to find me, she had witnessed me feeding a vampire. She even mentioned that the same vampire had followed us and was currently waiting outside. That caught my attention. So Valeria had followed us after all. Meanwhile, the three of them remained silent, clearly struggling to reconcile everything. They knew Rika could read people, and they knew what vampires were capable of. But even that wasn't enough to make this believable. I glanced at Rika and asked what the plan was now. She answered without hesitation. They would let the others calm down, and in the meantime, she would chain me to a chair and blindfold me. I paused. That was not what I expected. I couldn't help but question it. Before I could question it any further, Rika was already tying me to a chair. She had brought me into what looked like a cellar in the basement. No windows, just a single door. The other three members of her party stood near the entrance, watching quietly as they tried to process everything that had just happened. I couldn't help but comment on it. So this favor she needed was for me to act as food for some kind of monster girl. She confirmed it without hesitation, as casual as ever. That explained the guilt I had noticed earlier, especially after the way she reacted to me and Valeria. She asked if I really had to say everything out loud, and I admitted that I did. If nothing else, I figured I could at least give her a hard time for dragging me into this without explaining anything. Her eyebrow lifted at that, and she fired back immediately, pointing out that I wasn't exactly in a position to joke after willingly letting myself get tied to a chair. She tightened the ropes a little more than necessary, a playful edge in her expression. I acknowledged it with a quick apology, though neither of us really meant it. A quiet laugh broke the exchange. The knight, Rosalind, stepped forward, having watched the whole interaction. She commented that she was surprised to see Rika getting along so well with a man, considering her usual attitude. She added that she sometimes worried Rika might react harshly if a man said the wrong thing. Yet here we were, talking like this. From her tone, it sounded like she was teasing Rika about being unusually fond of me. Rika dismissed it quickly, calling me nothing special and reminding everyone that she had already stabbed me earlier, as if that proved she hadn't softened at all. That seemed to raise a different kind of concern in Rosalind's expression, but she didn't dwell on it. Instead, she turned to me and introduced herself properly. She explained that she was Rosalind, a paladin and the leader of Rose Thorns. She gestured to the others, Circe the wizard and Tala the druid. I acknowledged them, noting their small gestures in return. Then Rosalind shifted to the main point. She emphasized that their friend needed my help, and that along with everything else they were asking, she wanted me to avoid asking personal questions. I understood immediately why she was the leader. She had a composed presence that made it difficult to refuse, even if I had wanted to. I agreed, though I did ask one thing. I wanted to know what kind of monster their friend was. The room fell silent for a moment. Then she answered, a succubus. I felt a strange sense of excitement at first, almost reflexive, but that didn't last. She immediately clarified the situation. Their friend had been captured by succubi only a few days ago, and during that time she had somehow been turned into one of them. That changed everything. I thought it through. Succubi were all female, which meant they likely created more of their kind by transforming others. Rosalind continued, her tone growing sharper with anger. Their friend had been targeted because of her nature, someone noble, someone pure. The demons had even given her the key to her own cage, letting her suffer while waiting for her to give in. And despite all of that, she had resisted. She had chosen to starve rather than lose herself and harm others. That realization settled heavily. I had been too quick to associate succubi with the lighter versions I had seen in stories. The reality here was far harsher. I expressed concern, asking if she would be able to feed on me safely. I knew I wouldn't die, but that didn't mean there wouldn't be consequences. Rosalind explained that was exactly why I was being restrained. By tying me down, I wouldn't be able to interfere or do anything that might weaken her resolve. A simple kiss would be enough for her to feed. By then, Rika had finished securing the ropes. She stated that there was no backing out now, and that once the blindfold was on, everything would be ready. Rosalind gave Rika one last look before turning to leave, saying she would go speak with their friend. Cersei and Tala followed shortly after, leaving just the two of us in the room. The atmosphere shifted. I wasn't entirely sure what to say. There was something undefined between us. I couldn't clearly label what my relationship with Rika was, but I knew that if there was a possibility of it becoming something more, I wouldn't be against it. Before I could figure out how to approach it, she spoke first. She told me not to be misled by Rosalind's teasing, and then explained what succubi actually were. They were demons that preyed on desire, and death at their hands was anything but peaceful. That wiped away any lingering misconceptions I had. I admitted that I had misunderstood, and that the reality made a lot more sense now. She laughed at my reaction, then added that I would likely have to get used to this if they couldn't find a way to cure their friend. I made a mental note to reconsider how quickly I trusted people, especially when she asked me that question earlier. She told me to stop talking. Then she leaned in. Her face came close, her eyes meeting mine, and I caught a faint blush paired with a genuine smile. It was the last thing I saw before she covered my eyes with the blindfold. Darkness. Silence followed. I wondered if she had already left, but I hadn't heard her move, not even the door. I called out to her, but there was no response. She really was skilled. Then I felt it, a soft warmth against my lips. It was brief, almost fleeting, but unmistakable. A light kiss that lingered just enough to leave an impression before it was gone. Before I could react, I heard movement. Footsteps, quick and quiet. The door opened, then closed. And just like that, I was alone again. Tied to a chair and blindfolded, I sat alone in the middle of the cellar, still trying to process what had just happened. Rika had just stolen my first kiss while I couldn't even move, and the worst part was that I had been fully awake for it. There was no way she hadn't known I would realize it was her. So she does like me. The thought settled in easily, but it only led to more questions. Why do it like that? It felt exactly like her, avoiding things directly, acting difficult, hiding what she actually felt behind that sharp, bratty attitude. The warmth of that moment still lingered on my lips. Back in my previous life, I hadn't exactly been lucky when it came to relationships, though most of that was my own doing. I had always kept to myself. Kissing wasn't a big deal where I came from, but in more traditional settings it could carry a lot of meaning. Still, I doubted it meant something that serious here. It was probably just Rika being Rika. Eventually, I heard the door open, pulling me out of my thoughts. Voices followed, faint, but I could make out encouragement in their tone. They were trying to convince her. That realization felt strange. I never thought I'd be in a situation where people were reassuring someone that it was safe to feed on me. Even so, I understood what this meant for her. She had chosen to starve rather than hurt anyone. If I could help, then I would, no matter how this turned out. The door closed again and I felt the shift in the room. Now it was just the two of us. I steadied myself. This is it. Before I could gather my thoughts further, a quiet voice reached me. It sounded weak, dry, like someone who had been pushed far beyond their limits. She asked if I was sure. I answered immediately, not giving her time to doubt herself. I told her it was fine, that I had already dealt with something similar before, and that she didn't need to hold back. There was a brief pause before she accepted. Then I felt her move closer. Her weight settled against me, light, too light. There was barely anything there, just the fragile presence of someone who had been starving for far too long. She asked if I was ready. I told her I was. Then she leaned in. Her lips met mine. At first, the sensation was overwhelming, something that felt almost unreal. There was a sweetness to it, something rich and layered, as if every sense was being pulled into the moment. Warmth spread through me quickly, too quickly, and with it came a strange heaviness, like something was being drawn out of me. I could feel it. My strength, my life, it was being taken. And yet, I remained aware. My body felt the strain, but my mind stayed clear. My healing worked constantly, balancing the drain, keeping me steady even as everything else tried to pull me under. As time passed, the illusion faded. The sweetness disappeared, replaced by something more real. Her lips were no longer soft in the same way. They were dry, worn down by starvation. But something else changed. She felt different, heavier, softer, stronger. I realized what was happening. She was growing. With every moment, as she drew more from me, her body began to change. What had started as something fragile and barely there was slowly becoming fuller, more defined. Her presence became more solid, more grounded. It made sense. If vampires used blood as a resource, then succubi must do something similar with vitality. Her form continued to shift, becoming what I imagined a demon of desire would look like. No longer weak or fading, but complete. At some point her lips softened again, but this time it wasn't an illusion. She had recovered enough for it to be real. That was when another thought hit me. Just how much had she taken? Valeria had described my blood as something that felt endless, and she had only stopped because her feeding had been interrupted. But this, she wasn't stopping. Not that I wanted her to. I reminded myself why I was here. Still, as things stabilized, I made a decision. If this was going to happen, then I wouldn't just endure it. I leaned into it, letting it become something normal. Not something forced or desperate, but something shared. The moment continued, steady and intense, until it finally broke. Not because she stopped, but because she couldn't continue in the same way. She had grown too much. Our positions no longer aligned, and the connection naturally ended. She spoke first, her voice completely different now. It carried warmth, depth, and a composed strength that hadn't been there before. She asked if I was all right. Before I could respond properly, her tone shifted again. Panic. She started questioning what had happened to her, but quickly tried to regain control. She began repeating her name over and over, almost like she was anchoring herself. Celestine del Miriel Revelry, second princess of the Revia kingdom. She repeated it again and again, holding on to it. I stayed quiet, watching, listening. Then I felt it. Her body was changing again, shrinking. Her form adjusted, becoming smaller, more stable. It wasn't just shrinking, it felt controlled, deliberate. She was reshaping herself. That made sense. A succubus would need to adapt their form. Eventually, the changes stopped. She settled somewhere in between what she had been at the start and what she had become during the process. Then she apologized, saying she thought she was okay now. I told her not to worry and admitted that I had enjoyed the moment, though I wasn't entirely sure if that was the right thing to say. She seemed just as uncertain. Then she asked if she could remove my blindfold. I agreed and asked if she could untie me as well. As the blindfold came off, my vision returned, and then I saw her. Blonde hair framed her face, catching what little light there was and reflecting it in a way that felt almost unnatural. Her eyes were a pale, clear blue, calm and open like the sky. There was a softness to her, something refined and composed, but it wasn't entirely human. Curved horns extended from her head, and her lips still carried a faint trace of something deeper, something tied to what she had become. She thanked me sincerely, acknowledging that what had happened was simply me helping her. But even so, she said it had been her first kiss, and because of that she made a declaration. From this moment forward, if I ever chose to claim it, she would offer her hand in marriage. Rosalind and Tala moved in to untie me, and before I could even fully process what had just happened, I found myself sitting there in the middle of the cellar, completely stunned. Celestine had just offered to marry me, and before I could even respond, she had passed out on top of me. Everything had happened so fast. One moment she was speaking clearly, and the next her exhaustion caught up to her. Rosalind, Tala, and Cersei rushed in, reassured me that everything was fine, and then Cersei carried her away. I looked at Rosalind and Tala, trying to organize my thoughts. I awkwardly brought up what had just happened with Celestine, unsure how to even phrase it. Rosalind answered first, explaining that since I wasn't from around here, I might not understand. In their tradition, a first kiss was considered a promise, and the one who received it gained the right to claim the other's hand in marriage. Tala immediately cut in, clearly unimpressed, criticizing the custom outright. Rosalind quickly scolded her before turning back to me. I couldn't help but catch the word Tala had used earlier, cedars. It sounded like a term for city people, though the way she said it felt a little sharper than that. Rosalind clarified things further, explaining that in Tala's tribe, marriage was decided through combat. Beating someone nearly to death was how they chose a partner. I glanced at Tala, taking a closer look. She was tall and athletic, with tan skin and long brown hair braided together with vines and plant life. Her green eyes matched the markings across her body, and her clothing was formed from living plants that wrapped around her while leaving much of her skin exposed. Despite being a caster, her physique was undeniably strong. When she noticed me staring, she stood up and struck a confident pose, showing off her build without hesitation. She explained her tribe's tradition more directly. Their coming-of-age ceremony involved men fighting the women, and whoever won would claim their partner. In her case, no one had been able to defeat her, not even the elders. So she left her tribe in search of someone strong enough to be worthy. Rosalind added that this was how Tala ended up here, and that she had already caused quite a stir by challenging the male members of the guild. They had to step in before things escalated further, eventually bringing her into the party. While Rose Thorns wasn't the strongest group overall, Tala herself was the strongest individual hunter among them. Tala turned her attention back to me, adjusting her tone slightly after catching herself earlier. She acknowledged that surviving as succubus was impressive, but pointed out that the fact I could still be restrained by something like ropes made me weak. She told me that if I ever became strong, I should let her know. Then she mentioned they would discuss what to do about the king and the princess the next day, before turning and leaving the room. I watched her go, then looked back at Rosalind. I couldn't help but comment that between Rika and Tala, I was starting to understand why Nadu had said the guild had issues with men. Rosalind let out a slightly awkward laugh. She admitted that while each of them had their own issues, they were all good people at heart. The fact that Tala hadn't dismissed me outright was a good sign, and Rika getting along with me was even more surprising. She added that Cersei would likely warm up to me as well. I found myself agreeing internally. Rosalind really did hold the group together. She was already thinking ahead, considering how I would fit in with them, which made sense given my role in helping Celestine. Then I realized something. I asked where Rika was, since she hadn't been there when Celestine passed out. Rosalind stood up after finishing with the ropes and offered me a hand to help me up. She explained that Rika had gone to deal with the vampire who had followed me. She had wanted to stop her or send someone with her, but Rika had insisted on handling it alone. That made me pause. Honestly, I found myself more concerned for Valeria in that situation. Rosalind mentioned she was going to get some rest, noting that it had been a long day. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, that while she appreciated what I had done, if I tried anything inappropriate while they slept, she would make sure I regretted it. I assured her that wasn't something she needed to worry about, especially since Rika would probably deal with me first if I even tried. That seemed to pique her curiosity. She asked what exactly I had done to get on Rika's good side so quickly, considering we had only met that morning. I admitted I wasn't entirely sure. At first, Rika hadn't been particularly friendly, but after that initial interaction, things had just worked out. Rosalind seemed thoughtful, saying they would see how things developed. She led me out of the cellar, apparently satisfied enough with Rika's judgment to trust me for now. Before leaving, she pointed out the kitchen in case I was hungry and told me to take any available bedroom upstairs. I wished her good night. Now alone in the mansion's foyer, I took a moment to assess myself. I still didn't feel hungry or tired. Those basic human needs seemed distant, almost unnecessary. Even so, I decided I should at least try to eat something. I made my way into the kitchen and looked around. Nothing there looked familiar. Still, I picked up one of the plants from a basket. It had a shape similar to a dumbbell. I took a bite and the bitterness hit immediately, forcing me to cough it out. I tried another, this one purple and round like an apple. That turned out to be even worse. Sharp, sour, and overly acidic. It felt like I had just bitten into this world's version of a lemon. I decided that was enough experimentation for one night. I would just eat whatever they ate when the time came. I moved to the sink and noticed running water. Whether it was because this was a mansion, or because this world had more advanced systems, or even magic, I couldn't tell. But in the quiet of the night, it gave me time to think. I poured myself a glass of water and even added a bit to the sour fruit. Before heading upstairs, most of the bedrooms were closed. I briefly considered checking if Rika or Valeria were inside any of them, but quickly dismissed the idea. That would definitely cross a line. Instead, I found my way to a balcony. The sun was just beginning to rise. I sat down with my drink and watched as the light slowly spread across the horizon. Day 1 had ended, and it had been a lot. I had been sent to another world, met a female ninja, joined a hunter's guild, discovered I was mostly useless, encountered a vampire, been stabbed through the heart, fought and defeated one, met an all-female elite party, experienced my first kiss, met a succubus princess, received a proposal, and now I was sitting in a mansion watching the sunrise. I took a quiet breath. Surely tomorrow wouldn't be this chaotic. By the time I noticed, the warm yellows and oranges of sunrise had already faded into a clear blue sky. The glass in my hand was still half full, tinted slightly purple from the citrus fruit I had mixed into it earlier. I leaned over the balcony watching the birds in the garden below. They had 4 wings. That alone was enough to remind me I wasn't home anymore. Even if everything else, the trees, the grass, looked normal at first glance. Then again, I didn't know enough about plants to say that for sure. They could be completely different, and I wouldn't even realize it. I thought it through as I watched them move. There were probably similarities between worlds. Plants were still green, they still relied on sunlight, but the details would be different. Maybe some birds here only had 2 wings, or maybe 4 wings were necessary to survive in a world with monsters. Either way, there was a gap in my knowledge, and if I wanted to blend in, I would have to fill it. A voice broke my train of thought. Cersei stepped onto the balcony and took a seat behind me, commenting that I was up early, though she assumed it made sense if I had grown up on a farm. I turned toward her. Without her usual hat, I could see her more clearly. She was small with pale skin, black hair, and light blue eyes. Her bangs hung low, partially covering the dark circles under her eyes. She wore a simpler robe this morning, and her thin frame matched what I would expect from a magic user. I asked if she couldn't sleep. She responded sharply, pointing out the obvious and adding that her sleep schedule was a mess. That response caught me off guard. Maybe she was just tired. Rosalind had mentioned that she and Rika weren't exactly fond of men. I tried to be polite and asked if she wanted anything, maybe some water. She snapped back immediately, asking why she would come here if she needed something instead of getting it herself. I stopped myself from reacting. Getting irritated wouldn't help. Instead, I shifted my approach. I asked if I could ask her some questions about magic. She shut that down just as quickly, telling me to go read a book instead. She made it clear she hadn't spent years studying just to explain things to someone casually. I kept my tone steady. I told her I couldn't read. That seemed to amuse her slightly, though she still brushed me off, telling me to learn that first before worrying about magic. I clarified that I wasn't trying to learn magic itself. I didn't have mana, chi, or essence, so I couldn't use it anyway, but I still wanted to understand how it worked. She sighed, clearly annoyed, and told me it was pointless. In her view, I wasn't going to make it as a hunter, so there was no reason to try. Whether they cured the princess or not, I would likely be rewarded and could live comfortably. I understood what she meant, but that wasn't what I wanted. I told her that even if I couldn't succeed, I still wanted to try. I had already lived a quiet life once, and while it had its place, I wanted something different now. She called me naive and ignorant, saying I didn't understand what being a hunter actually meant. I agreed with her. That was exactly why I was asking. She groaned, realizing I wasn't going to stop. Eventually, she gave in. She told me to ask what I wanted. I didn't waste the opportunity. I started with the basics, repeating what Rika had told me. She related to the body, mana to the mind, and essence to the soul, and asked if they functioned like resources used to perform abilities. She confirmed that was mostly correct, adding that attributes determined what you could do. I pressed further, asking how they actually worked, whether there were more attributes, how monsters like vampires functioned, and how the 12 abilities tied into everything. She questioned if I really knew nothing. I admitted that I didn't. She finally sat up slightly, still annoyed, and explained. Every living thing possessed all 3 attributes, but having an attribute meant being able to control it. A value of 0 didn't mean it didn't exist. It just meant I couldn't actively use it. That made sense. I moved away from the balcony and sat across from her, focusing fully now. I asked how abilities factored into all of this. She reminded me that I had already rolled them, but I explained that I had been too focused on my lack of attributes and my vitality to really pay attention. I only knew that most of them were average, with intelligence being slightly higher. She seemed skeptical of that, but continued anyway. Abilities influenced both the preparation and execution of techniques. Intelligence, for example, determined how many spells she could understand and how effectively she could use them. It also affected the strength of certain spells. I recalled what Rika had said about improving abilities and asked if mana users generally focused on intelligence. That was when she asked if I even knew what a class was. I hesitated, then admitted that I didn't. She made a remark comparing an 8 to a 0, implying I might not be as perceptive as I thought. But I ignored that and kept listening. She explained that a class was simply a way of describing how someone used their attributes and abilities. Then she listed the 12 abilities: strength, agility, dexterity, vitality, conviction, creativity, intelligence, empathy, wisdom, perception, charisma, and luck. I made a mental note to have someone write mine down later. She continued, explaining that abilities influence what kind of class you might pursue. For example, someone with mana and high luck might focus on chaos magic instead of arcane magic. High agility could lead to something like a spellblade, and combinations of attributes opened even more paths. She went on, describing how different combinations could create entirely different roles, even among people who shared similar attributes. Some classes used a single attribute, others combined two or even all three. It was complex, far more complex than I had expected. And of course, I couldn't use any of it. She pointed that out indirectly, saying this wasn't something I could fully understand through a few questions. I agreed, but still asked one more thing. I wanted to know how monsters, especially vampires, fit into all of this. Before she could answer, another voice cut in. Valeria. She stood at the doorway, casually leaning against the frame, suggesting that I should be asking her instead. Cersei reacted immediately, jumping up and taking a defensive stance, demanding to know why a vampire was there. Valeria calmly replied that Rika had allowed her to stay. Cersei told her to move away from the entrance, and Valeria complied, stepping closer to my side of the table. Without another word, Cersei left the balcony, clearly frustrated, shouting toward the inside of the mansion as she went. And just like that, the day had already started escalating again. So much for things calming down. Valeria and I sat side by side on the balcony while raised voices echoed from inside the mansion. Cersei was clearly upset, criticizing Rika for letting a vampire stay the night, while Rika pushed back, defending her judgment. I glanced at Valeria and tried to keep the conversation grounded, ignoring the argument happening about her just a few steps away. I asked if Rika had really allowed her to stay. She confirmed it, explaining that it came after answering a long series of questions, many of them personal. That didn't sit entirely well with me, and I told her I would talk to Rika later. I apologized if the questioning had made her uncomfortable. She admitted that it had, but reassured me that it was fine and that I didn't need to bring it up. Apparently, Rika had promised not to share anything she said. That caught my attention. Why would Rika promise something like that? I started to ask what exactly had been discussed, but before I could finish, the argument moved onto the balcony. Cersei immediately pointed out that Valeria was still alive, clearly implying that Rika's judgment had been reckless. Rika dismissed the concern, saying the outcome proved her right. She even added that if Valeria had lost control, she would have gone straight for me, not Cersei, and then casually mentioned how Valeria reacted when drinking my blood. That was enough to make Valeria visibly flustered. Cersei pressed the issue, asking how Rika could not see the problem, but Rika remained firm, stating that Valeria wasn't a threat and had no harmful intent. Both of them looked toward Valeria, who was still trying to recover from the embarrassment. Rika asked if there was still any doubt. Cersei gave in, though not willingly. The tension eased just enough for everyone to sit down. I ended up between them, with Valeria to my right, still flustered, and Rika to my left, looking entirely too pleased with herself. Across from us sat Cersei, still clearly annoyed. After a moment of silence, I decided to move things forward. I asked what the next steps were. Cersei answered first, saying she still wasn't sure if it was even possible, but she would continue researching a way to turn a succubus back into a human. Rosalind added that they would also need to inform the king, which would be difficult since they couldn't bring Celestine with them. I asked why that was. Rika answered immediately, pointing out that Celestine didn't want to be around men, and that they had already cleared out the entire mansion before bringing her here. Then she added that I was the exception. Since Celestine couldn't harm me, I would be her source of food, moving forward. I took a moment to process that. So this was my role now. I had been reincarnated into a new world, and instead of becoming some kind of hero, I had ended up as a food source for two different kinds of monsters. It wasn't exactly what I expected, but at this point, it was better to accept reality and work with it. I told them I didn't mind helping, but while I was here, I wanted to get stronger. I mentioned that Valeria had already agreed to try teaching me blood arts. That immediately set Cersei off again. She accused Valeria of taking advantage of me, pointing out that as her food source, I was essentially giving her power, while gaining little in return. Valeria pushed back, clearly offended, insisting she hadn't deceived me. Cersei dismissed it, explaining that vampiric magic was a racial ability, something innate and not something a human could learn. Valeria corrected her, calling it blood arts and explaining that while it was tied to their nature, it still functioned through chi. Vampires didn't produce chi naturally, but that didn't mean it couldn't be taught, especially since I would be using my own energy. The two of them continued to clash, neither willing to back down. She pointed out that my vitality made this situation unique. There were cases of humans learning abilities from other races, and since both vampires and I lacked chi as a usable attribute, this might actually work in my favor. I backed that up, saying this was one of the best opportunities I had. I was already here for Celestine, so if they could help me too, it would mean a lot. Cersei looked at me, clearly unconvinced, but also outnumbered. Eventually she gave in, though reluctantly. She told me not to bother her too much and warned that once Celestine was cured, any support from her would end. Before I could respond, two more voices joined in. Rosalind teased Cersei for being unexpectedly cooperative, while Tala simply stated that she didn't understand why, since I was still weak. Rosalind tried to keep the tone light, but Tala didn't seem interested in softening her words. Cersei clarified that she wasn't doing it out of kindness, but because I was necessary for Celestine's condition. Rosalind and Tala took their seats, completing the group. Everyone was there now, except for Celestine. Rosalind mentioned that she had checked on her and confirmed she was awake, but had chosen to stay in her room. Then she took control of the discussion. She recapped everything that had happened. They had successfully rescued the princess and eliminated the group responsible, though they still needed to understand why she had been targeted specifically. After that, they had relocated here and brought me in as a sustainable source of energy for Celestine. She hesitated slightly when describing my role, and I could tell it wasn't easy for her. I reassured her that there wasn't really a better way to phrase it. She nodded and continued. They needed to inform the royal family, and while the situation was complicated, she believed they had achieved the best possible outcome. She assigned roles. Rosalind, Tala, and Cersei would go speak with the king. Rika would stay behind to watch over both Celestine and me, ensuring neither of us left the property. I couldn't help but note that this effectively put me under house arrest as well. She apologized, explaining that they couldn't risk me disappearing. At the same time, she pointed out that the estate was large enough for me to train with Valeria privately, and with Rika staying behind, I would have more than enough to occupy my time. Rika reacted immediately to that comment, clearly not appreciating the implication. Rosalind brushed it off and brought things to a close. With that, the plan was set, and everyone began preparing to move. I stood in the backyard with my arms at my sides, fists clenched and elbows bent, trying to focus. I let out a long, exaggerated shout as I tried to gather energy, or at least something resembling it. Honestly, I was just copying what I had seen in anime, hoping something would click. Rika and Valeria had already given me a basic explanation about feeling chi and the flow of blood in the body, but translating that into action was proving to be a different story. I pushed harder, raising my voice again, putting more effort into it, but nothing changed. Eventually, I exhaled and admitted it wasn't working. Rika, lounging upside down on a nearby bench with her legs hooked over the backrest, pointed out the obvious. From her perspective, I was just yelling in a garden and expecting something to happen. Valeria sat beside her, leaning forward with her elbows on her thighs, doing her best to guide me. For her, blood arts were as natural as breathing, but for me, it felt like trying to consciously control every heartbeat. She told me to focus on my heart, to feel the blood moving through my body, the flow through arteries and veins, and how chi moved alongside it. I tried, but all I could really sense was my heartbeat. Rika adjusted the explanation, telling me I was focusing too much on blood itself. As a human, chi existed throughout my entire body, not just in my blood. She described it as a system, with lungs, heart, stomach, and brain all working together in balance. Even with that, I admitted it still wasn't clicking. Rika reminded me that I didn't even have a chi attribute, so expecting results in a single day was unrealistic. For now, I just needed to focus on feeling the flow. Valeria added that there was no rush and that I would get it eventually. That was fair enough. I sat down in the grass, leaning back on my hands, and looked over at the two of them. After a moment, a thought crossed my mind and I asked if there was some kind of demon king trying to take over the world. Rika immediately answered, mentioning someone named Nykthos. So there really was a demon king figure. That tracked. She explained that he called himself a god of darkness and was gathering demons, devils, and other monsters, but made it clear he was far beyond my level. Even their party avoided him, leaving that kind of threat to heroes. As she spoke, I couldn't help but recall my encounter with the Overseer of Death. Since arriving in this world, my sense of fear had dulled significantly. Part of that came from knowing death wasn't the end, but more than that, I had already stood before something far beyond comprehension. Compared to that, everything else felt smaller. Still, that didn't mean I could actually fight something like that. I shifted the topic back to something more immediate and asked Valeria about the attack she used earlier, along with her dagger. I wanted to understand how she manipulated blood. She explained that liquid blood was vulnerable to being taken by others, so hardening it made it stable, turning it into something as durable as iron while still remaining lightweight. That made sense. I raised my hand and tried to imagine blood flowing out of my palm and forming into a blade. Then I remembered something. When she used that large-scale attack, she had chanted, but she hadn't needed to say anything when forming a dagger. She explained that simpler techniques were easier and more familiar, so they didn't require a chant. Rika expanded on that, saying it applied to all skills. The more practiced you were, the less you needed verbal activation, and silent casting had clear advantages, especially for someone like her. That made me pause. If that was the case, then I needed an actual starting point. I asked Valeria to teach me a blood art instead of just having me sit there shouting. She pointed out that no one had told me to shout in the first place, and that today was supposed to be about sensing and meditation. Still, she gave in and demonstrated. She spoke the chant, guiding the process step by step, and I watched as blood formed in her palm before solidifying into a crimson dagger. That was exactly what I wanted. I immediately tried to replicate it, repeating the chant with confidence. Nothing happened. Behind me, I could hear Rika quietly laughing. She teased me, bringing up the name I had used earlier in the fight, which made me pause. I asked how much of that fight she had actually seen, since there had been a long stretch where I was just getting hit before she showed up. She brushed it off casually, pretending she hadn't said anything. Valeria, confused, asked about the name. Rika referred to it as my special move. I immediately denied that and tried to steer the conversation back, asking if there was any blood art that involved covering my body in spikes. Valeria said she didn't know of one, and added that it sounded inefficient. Rika used that to point out that Valeria's earlier attack had also been inefficient, which led to a brief argument about its effectiveness. Then Valeria mentioned something about noble class techniques before suddenly stopping herself. She had clearly said more than she intended. I told her there was no rush, but I did ask if feeding her more would make her stronger. She confirmed that it would, explaining that older and noble vampires had more blood and access to more resources, which made them stronger and placed them at the top of their hierarchy. Then she redirected me back to training, telling me to actually focus on the spell instead of just yelling. She was right. I stood up again, resetting my stance, and began repeating the chant more steadily. I focused on my heartbeat, trying to feel the rhythm, each pulse, each flow. I recalled the moment I had been stabbed, the sensation of my body reacting, the surge of energy when I shattered that blade. I kept repeating the chant, trying to align my thoughts with the flow inside me, but then my mind started to drift. I questioned the method itself. Vampires use chi within their blood, combined with their natural ability to control it. But what if I didn't try to control it at all? What if I simply triggered it? No precision. No shaping. Just release. Not something controlled like forming a dagger. Something more instinctive. Something raw. I spoke again, adjusting the chant slightly, following the direction my thoughts were taking me. This time, something responded. A reaction ignited inside my chest. There was no structure, no control, and no attribute guiding it. Just force. Then pain. It felt like countless sharp points tearing through me from the inside, spreading outward all at once. There was no time to process it. Everything went dark. As I slowly regained consciousness, my senses returned piece by piece. The first thing I noticed was the soreness. Pain lingered throughout my body, and I could feel something wet beneath me while a soft warmth cradled my head. Voices reached me next, though they were distant and unclear at first. Fragments of conversation drifted in, broken and indistinct, but I could tell there were two people talking nearby. As my awareness sharpened, I recognized them as Rika and Valeria. It even sounded like Rika was quietly laughing. Then my eyes finally opened. The first thing that came out of my mouth was a simple complaint about the pain, and that only made Rika laugh more. She pointed out how predictable that was and immediately questioned why it had taken me nearly 2 minutes to wake up, even though my body had already healed. Valeria cut in, telling her not to overwhelm me and admitting she didn't understand how I survived, but that it didn't matter as long as I was okay. I took a moment to look around and understand my situation. I was still in the garden, lying in a pool of my own blood. Rika stood off to my right, looking down at me without the slightest hint of concern. I couldn't tell whether that was reassuring or slightly worrying. A bit farther back, I spotted Celestine. She was keeping her distance, clearly still unsure about being close to everyone. From the way she was positioned, it seemed she had been watching from the mansion and rushed out when I collapsed. I could still hear Valeria, but I couldn't see her at first. Then I tried to move my head and finally realized where she was. The warmth beneath me wasn't the ground, it was her. She had knelt down in the blood to support my head on her lap, her thighs on either side of me like a cushion. When I looked up, our eyes met. Her expression was full of relief and happiness, her red hair falling around my face, catching the sunlight and forming something like a curtain between us. She asked how I was feeling. All I managed to say was a simple greeting. It was an oddly intimate moment, and I wasn't entirely sure how to respond to it. Then Celestine cleared her throat and stepped forward, breaking the atmosphere. She addressed Valeria and asked to take over, stating that as my fiancé, I should be resting on her instead. I asked what a fiancé was, which only made things more complicated. She explained that it meant we were to be married, since I had been her first kiss. Valeria, clearly confused, repeated the key points, trying to process what that meant. Rika stepped in, explaining what a kiss was in human terms, and comparing marriage to the bond between parents. That explanation hit Valeria all at once, and her expression shifted rapidly into panic. She questioned how something like that could already be decided when we had just met, and then immediately declared that she would kiss me too. The moment she said it, she flushed, clearly realizing what she had just announced. Celestine objected right away, insisting that it didn't work like that and emphasizing the importance of a first kiss. I could feel the situation spiraling. From my perspective, this had escalated far too quickly. There was no way both of them were seriously talking about marriage over something like this. It felt more like emotions running wild than anything grounded. Rika stepped in again, this time clearly irritated. She pointed out that they were getting ahead of themselves, reminding them that they barely knew me, and questioning whether they even understood my situation or feelings. That seemed to bring both of them back to reality. They looked at each other, realizing how far they had gone. Valeria admitted that she had no claim unless it had truly been mutual and acknowledged that what happened had been about survival, not something she could demand more from. Celestine also admitted that she might not fully understand the significance of a kiss yet. Watching them pull back like that made me feel a little guilty. I didn't want to reject them outright, but I also couldn't just accept something as serious as marriage based on all this. I slowly sat up, still feeling sore, but wanting to ease the tension. I told them honestly that I would be lucky to have either of them, but I wasn't ready for marriage. Then, thinking quickly, I added that my first kiss had actually been stolen earlier, so technically I couldn't make any decisions about that yet. That immediately shifted the conversation again. Celestine reacted strongly, asking who had taken it. I tried to downplay it, saying it wasn't important, but that only made her more focused on it. She pointed out that they had just said how important it was, and now she wanted to know what that meant for us. I admitted that what we shared had been my second kiss. That was when I noticed it. Rika, who had been standing off to the side, suddenly turned bright red and looked away, so she didn't know. She hadn't been trying to take anything from me earlier. She had been giving something of her own. That realization settled in quietly. Meanwhile, Valeria and Celestine were still focused on their line of questioning, trying to understand how human customs worked. Valeria wondered if kisses were something shared mutually, while Celestine started thinking in terms of claims, and even suggested buying that claim. That caught me completely off guard. Before I could properly respond, Valeria countered with her own plan, insisting she would take my kiss back and give it again properly. At that point, it was clear things were spiraling again. Their argument picked up, and I could already see it heading in a direction I wasn't ready to deal with. Then, unexpectedly, Valeria's stomach growled. That small interruption gave me the perfect opening. I immediately suggested we take a break and get something to eat, using the timing as an excuse to redirect everything. For once, it felt like the situation might calm down. At least, that was the hope. Things didn't get any less awkward. If anything, they only became worse. I found myself sitting on the edge of the bed, stuck between Celestine and Valeria, with no clear way out. Even after we left the garden, their argument hadn't stopped. By the time I cleaned up and returned inside, they were still going back and forth about who would eat first. Eventually, they reached a compromise, though it felt more like a temporary ceasefire than an actual resolution, and decided they would feed at the same time. Celestine settled across my lap, angled slightly to the side with both legs draped over my right thigh. Her hip rested against me naturally, and her body leaned in just enough that I could feel her warmth. One of her hands spread gently across my chest, while the other cupped my face with careful intention. She didn't pull me in, but instead positioned herself as if she belonged there. Behind me, Valeria knelt on the bed, her knees framing my hips, as she pressed firmly against my back. There was no hesitation in the way she held me. Her arms slid over my shoulders and wrapped around me completely, her grip firm, almost possessive, as if she didn't want to let go. Between the two of them, I felt completely pinned. They were still arguing. Celestine insisted she should be in front since she needed to kiss me, while Valeria countered that she could take more from my neck and questioned why she was being limited. I tried to make sense of it, but it felt like I was missing something deeper behind their urgency. So I spoke up, trying to ground the situation. I pointed out that there was no need to rush into marriage, that regardless of what happened, I wouldn't abandon either of them. To me, marriage should be about love, not necessity. Even as I said it, I knew I might be making things more complicated, but I couldn't ignore it. I didn't want a relationship built solely on survival. Both of them fell quiet for a moment, their expressions softening as embarrassment replaced the tension. They had just been warned earlier, and yet they had fallen right back into the same behavior. Valeria spoke first, admitting that she had gotten jealous the moment Celestine called herself my fiancé. She explained that everything had happened so quickly, and after being treated with kindness and trust, she felt like she was suddenly losing something important. Celestine followed, confessing that seeing me resting on Valeria's lap had stirred something similar in her. She spoke about how she had always dreamed of love, even though her position as a princess meant that dream was unlikely, and how becoming a succubus had made everything feel even more distant. In that moment, she had been afraid of losing the one chance she thought she had found. Listening to them, it became obvious. They weren't just arguing. They were scared, and I hadn't done anything to reassure them. I admitted that part was my fault, that instead of helping them feel secure, I had let things escalate to the point where they felt the need to cling to me like this. Before I could say more, Celestine straightened up and leaned in closer, her posture shifting with determination rather than hesitation. She told me not to apologize, then spoke clearly about how she felt. Even if she wasn't ready for marriage, and even if things might change in the future, right now she would choose me, whether she was human or a succubus. Then, without missing a beat, she added that she would even accept Valeria as a second wife, acknowledging that Valeria clearly cared just as much. My face heated up instantly. Second wife. Valeria leaned over my shoulder, tilting her head slightly as she met my eyes. Her smile was bright, free of the earlier tension. She said she didn't mind either, even suggesting that Celestine could be the second, and reminded me that regardless of romance, our pact already tied us together. I tried to process it, but my thoughts couldn't quite keep up. The tension and insecurity from before had disappeared, yet somehow they had arrived at an even more intense conclusion. They moved closer, both of them now relaxed and playful, their earlier worries replaced with something lighter. Then they asked what I thought. I hesitated, but only for a moment. In the end, I gave in and admitted that I accepted both of them, because honestly, I would be lucky to have either one. They exchanged a glance, their expressions lighting up with excitement. Just like that, they turned it into a competition, declaring that the battle for first wife would be fair. Valeria added her own challenge, calling Celestine her rival while still accepting her as something close to a sister. And just like that, in this new world, I had somehow found myself in the middle of the most absurd yet strangely perfect situation imaginable. With their laughter returning and their tension gone, the two of them finally settled down, ready to begin feeding. In theory, this should have been a terrible situation. My essence was being drained by a succubus, while a vampire fed directly from my artery. For anyone else, this would have been a slow and painful death. But I had already left death behind. My healing had erased the pain minutes ago, leaving me with a completely different kind of challenge. Don't move my hands. Stay calm. They're just eating. Nothing strange about this. That thought didn't last long. A soft sound broke through my focus, and I immediately regretted trying to stay calm. The two monsters with me were Celestine and Valeria, both of whom had not long ago declared themselves my fiancés. Celestine had once been a holy princess who chose to starve rather than lose herself after becoming a succubus. Valeria, on the other hand, was a vampire who avoided human blood and whose innocence came out most when she was embarrassed. Neither of them should have been ready for anything close to intimacy, and yet here they were, unintentionally putting me through the most overwhelming experience of my life. I need to stay focused. Think about something else. Bloodless? Yeah, my new move. Celestine's lips rested softly against mine, her breathing uneven and fragile. Every so often, a small, involuntary sound slipped through as her fingers traced along my jaw and into my hair, holding on to me as if she needed the contact to steady herself. Her body leaned into mine, careful despite the hunger guiding her actions. I remembered how the others had restrained me the last time she fed, worried about what her abilities might do, but I had already adapted to that. This wasn't the same situation anymore. My hands stayed at my sides, gripping the sheets so tightly my knuckles turned pale. Behind me, Valeria pressed close, her arms wrapped around my chest. Her fangs had pierced my neck, and although her saliva slowed my healing, the pain had already faded. What remained felt less like injury and more like a faint pressure, almost like a hesitant, lingering touch. If it had just been that, I could have handled it, but every time she swallowed, her entire body reacted. Small sounds escaped her, louder than Celestine's, and her body pressed closer with each movement, her warmth impossible to ignore. How are you making this harder? You're just eating. I know I taste good, but still. Celestine shifted slightly, her legs sliding just a little higher across mine. Valeria tightened her hold, her body pressing even closer against my back. I could feel my composure slipping. Then Valeria noticed. She lifted her head just enough to ask if having both of them at once was too much. Celestine followed, her lips still hovering near mine as she asked the same thing. Don't phrase it like that. I admitted it was a bit much and suggested we take turns in the future until I got used to it. Then, for some reason, I added that last part. Why did I say that? Celestine responded softly, her lips brushing mine as she spoke, and I could tell she understood more than she let on. Valeria, on the other hand, responded more innocently, reminding me not to back out of our deal before adding, with a bright laugh, that it was fine as long as she went first. Celestine made a small, competitive sound in response, insisting they would alternate. Yes, please keep arguing. I need a break. Instead, Valeria leaned back in, pressing against the same spot on my neck again. Celestine immediately matched her, deepening her own contact, not competing, fighting. Please fight. The intensity climbed just a bit too high, and before I could stop myself, my body reacted. I pulled away slightly, apologizing and admitting we should probably stop for now. Both of them paused immediately, the rivalry fading as they pulled back. I told them honestly that they were overwhelming me, not in a dangerous way, but in a way I wasn't prepared for. Valeria lowered her head, clearly starting to understand. Then she asked quietly if we could just stay like this for a little longer. Celestine agreed, saying they had already taken enough and just wanted to remain close for a bit. I exhaled and nodded. That I could handle. Celestine rested against my chest, her cheek near my collarbone, while Valeria shifted to my other side, no longer wrapping around me but still close, her head resting against my back. I realized then that I might actually be less prepared for this than they were. For a while, none of us spoke. The moment settled into something calm and quiet, and I finally let my hands move, resting them gently around them both. Then Valeria spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper, saying she thought she had won this round. Celestine immediately disagreed. I let myself fall back onto the bed, giving into the situation entirely as they leaned over me, still focused on their rivalry. I warned them that if they started another competition right now, I would do something. I wasn't sure what, but I would figure it out. They both smiled at that. Then they agreed on a truce until tomorrow. Great, so this is my life now. Then Celestine leaned in slightly and quietly thanked me for not going too far. Valeria quickly added her own thanks. Both of them pressed closer, their warmth spreading through me as they rested against my chest. I closed my eyes for a moment. Yeah, this really is my life now. And somehow, despite everything, I was looking forward to it. After feeding on me and running on almost no sleep from the night before, Celestine and Valeria eventually drifted off. Without thinking, the two of them curled up against me, settling in as if I were their pillow and gently pinning me in place. I tried to follow their lead and sleep as well, but it didn't come. Hunger and thirst were things I could still experience, but my body didn't seem to actually need them anymore. Sleep felt the same way. In the end, I just stayed there, holding them while they rested. Time passed quietly, and the room slowly filled with the warm glow of the setting sun. As they began to wake, their earlier boldness faded, replaced by the more familiar shyness I had come to expect from them. Without a word, they carefully untangled themselves from me and slipped away to compose themselves. Honestly, that version of them felt much more natural. Maybe waking up like that was just too close to something, more than either of them was ready for. I got out of bed and made my way back to the courtyard. They definitely got caught up in jealousy and competition earlier. Add in hunger, and it makes sense. I returned to the same spot in the garden where I had used bloodless. Most of the blood had already soaked into the ground, leaving only faint traces behind. I couldn't help but think about how ridiculous my situation had become. I had never even had a girlfriend before, and now I was somehow dealing with 2 potential wives. Maybe even 3 if things kept escalating. I shook my head. I was getting ahead of myself. There was something more important to focus on, getting stronger. I took a deep breath and steadied myself. I knew exactly what was coming. Still, I didn't hesitate. I began the chant again and triggered the technique. The pain returned instantly, just as intense as before, tearing through me from the inside. Everything went dark for a moment, but this time I regained consciousness before I even hit the ground. I let out a quiet complaint, unable to even raise my voice through the lingering sensation. It still hurt, but it was slightly more manageable than before. Maybe I could get used to it, or maybe it was just my healing doing its job. Either way, I stood back up and did it again. I repeated the process, falling, recovering, standing, and pushing forward, again and again. By the time I reached 10 repetitions, a familiar voice cut in. Rika commented that it wasn't bad. I looked around, trying to locate her, but couldn't see her at first. Then she revealed herself, hanging upside down from a nearby tree branch, her legs hooked over it, and her ponytail dangling close to the ground. She said she had been keeping watch from the building, reminding me that guarding me was still her responsibility while the others were gone. I thanked her. She accepted it, but immediately followed up by saying I should repay her for all her hard work. I could hear the smugness in her tone. I played along and asked what she wanted. She started probing, asking if there were any secrets I had been hiding, anything important I hadn't told her. That caught my attention. Was she talking about me being from another world? I responded cautiously, saying I wasn't sure what she meant. She pushed further, insisting she already knew, and that honesty mattered. Now I had to decide. Was she bluffing, or did she actually know? I pointed out that if she already knew, she wouldn't need to ask. She countered that maybe she was testing me. That sounded exactly like something she would do. Still, this wasn't something she could just guess. At that point, I realized I was starting to probe her just as much as she was probing me. She called me out on it immediately. I had to admit, I was outmatched in this kind of exchange. But if she really did know, telling her might actually help. There was too much about this world I didn't understand, so I gave in. I told her that if she didn't believe me, that was on her. She repeated that she already knew. Then, just as I started to say it, she finished it for me, stating plainly that I was from another world. Before I could even react, she immediately scolded me, saying I was too trusting and that I shouldn't reveal something like that so easily, especially when she hadn't actually confirmed it beforehand. I sat up, confused. I pointed out the contradiction. She wanted honesty, but was also criticizing me for being honest. She clarified that the problem wasn't honesty itself, but how easily I trusted others. I could have deflected or said it was personal instead. I let myself fall back onto the ground again, staring up at her as she dropped down from the tree and stood over me. Then her tone shifted slightly. She admitted that maybe she should have thanked me first, and that I was more honest than she expected men to be. There was a faint flush on her cheeks, even without direct light hitting her face. It was subtle, but noticeable. Given her reputation, it wasn't hard to guess where that came from. If I had to assume, it probably had something to do with someone in her past. I told her I wanted to tease her, but I could see she was genuinely trying to deal with her feelings. That was apparently the wrong thing to say. A sharp pain hit my chest as she stabbed me again, only for my healing to immediately push the weapon back out. She complained that acknowledging it out loud made it worse. I asked where that even came from. She took her weapon back and declared us even. I joked that she was lucky she was cute. That earned me another strike. She pointed out that it should have been fatal, and added that if I hadn't been from another world with abnormal abilities, I would already be dead. Then she sat down beside me, her earlier embarrassment fading. Her knee pressed lightly against mine, just enough that I could tell it wasn't accidental. She explained that our party was among the top ranked in the Federation, and that most people didn't know about humans being summoned from other worlds to become heroes. That caught my attention. So, I wasn't the only one. She clarified that my situation was different. Most heroes were summoned and trained by nations, and unless I had been discarded, I didn't fit that pattern. I explained how I got here, that I had died saving a child and was sent here afterward, even mentioning that I had been told to find her. She reacted with a hint of guilt, saying that made her feel bad for stabbing me. I brushed it off and called her a bratty tsundere. She didn't understand the term but promised to stab me for it later. I told her it was meant as a compliment. She ignored that and continued explaining. Not all heroes were summoned. Each race had a limit to their abilities, and those who broke past those limits could continue growing. Tala was an example, someone considered a prodigy for pushing those boundaries. That made me wonder where I stood. With my vitality, I should have had potential. But according to her, that was the strange part. Everything else about me was within normal human limits, and I had no attributes. The only reason she figured things out was because I told her about meeting death. She admitted I was difficult to read, which was why it had taken her time to piece it together. I couldn't help but think that 2 days wasn't exactly a long time. I asked if most heroes were from other worlds, and whether that applied to other races too. She explained that, as far as she knew, it was only humans. Other races had natural advantages, while humans didn't. People believed humans produced more heroes, but in reality, it was because they were the ones being summoned. I asked if I should keep my origin a secret. She confirmed that I absolutely should. It was a lot to take in, but it all fit together in a way that made sense. Still, there was one thing I needed right now. I told her that since she already knew everything, I needed her help getting stronger. She smiled and agreed, telling me she was here for that. Rika tossed a bosu into the dirt, and as I watched it land, she began explaining that this was Jafhe, setting the foundation for everything that followed. After I told her I was from another world, she had agreed to teach me about this one, and now she continued by explaining that Jafhe was the capital of the Revia kingdom, ruled by the Revelry family, Celestine's parents, and that everything around it followed a structured layout. As she spoke, she used another bosu to carve a line from the northeast to the northwest of Jafhe before bending it southward, explaining that this marked the Partition Mountains, and then, along the west side of that line, she began hatching the ground to indicate the primeval forest. She then poked several holes around the city, placing some along the mountains and forest, and a few more to the south and west of Jafhe, explaining that these represented towns and villages, each controlled by their respective nobles, who were allied with the Revelry family, while also noting that Revia was a major exporter of ore and lumber. As I took that in, I reasoned that the locations along the forest and mountains were likely tied to resources, while the ones to the southwest were probably focused on agriculture, which she immediately confirmed by explaining that food was the biggest import in the region, since even though there were farming villages, being a northern nation meant food became scarce during the winters. That made something click for me, because when I first met Rika, she had commented that I looked well fed, and at the time, I assumed it was just an observation, but now it was clear that food scarcity made that stand out more than I realized. I then considered my situation and suggested that, given the whole farm boy misunderstanding, I could just say I was from one of those villages. But she immediately pushed back, saying that if anyone asked, I should simply not tell them, because she would rather I didn't lie. That confused me, so I pointed out that she had just told me to keep my old life a secret, and she responded that this was exactly why I shouldn't tell anyone, adding with a slight edge that I owed nothing to anyone but her, which I noticed slipped out more possessively than she probably intended. She continued, her cheeks faintly red, explaining that the forest ended at the Black Sea, while the mountain range extended southeast, and as she drew an oval at a slight angle, forming an upside Y shape between the mountains and the lake, I recognized the geography almost immediately. Even though I wasn't an expert, I understood enough to connect it to tectonic plate interactions, where converging plates formed mountains and separating ones created seas. So when I pointed out that the corner area looked like a swamp, her eyebrows lifted in surprise. She confirmed that it was indeed a swamp, and added that it was the fallen kingdom of Ainamor, Valeria's homeland. Assuming she had told me, but I clarified that I had simply pieced it together from what I remembered about geography. That led her to assume I had studied to be a cartographer, but I explained that I had studied a wide range of subjects, which prompted her to question why, and while I admitted it was difficult to explain, I redirected the focus back to the map, acknowledging that it was Valeria's home. She studied me for a moment before letting it go, then explained that those swamplands had once been a human kingdom until the head mage turned into a lich and was ultimately slain by his own creations, the first vampires. I noted to myself that I should ask Valeria about that later, but for now I pointed out the empty space between regions, only for Rika to snap slightly that she had been getting to that before I interrupted her again. She drew a line from the midpoint of the sea eastward, marking the border with the Griff Empire, and then extended it sharply upward before curving it inward to form a bay that connected to the northern mountain range, explaining that this was the western coast and Crescent Bay, which completed the Federation's border. That caught my attention, so I asked about the Federation, and she explained that because of Nykthos, the Revia kingdom had formed an alliance with 4 other kingdoms, noting that there had once been a 5th, Vera, which had fallen the previous year. She clarified that while Vera was technically saved by the Empire, it was more accurate to say it had been conquered during a battle against demons, and then absorbed into the Empire. Continuing her explanation, she extended the coastline southwest past the Empire's border and identified the region as the Demonic Territories, explaining that this was where Nykthos first appeared about 100 years ago, conquered the land, declared himself the god of darkness, and had been at war with the rest of the world ever since. I couldn't help but think that I was fortunate to have been placed so far away from that, because there was no way I could stand against something like a fallen overseer, and that was a problem for actual heroes, not me. She added that before Nykthos there had been no empire or federation, only scattered warring nations, and that while things had changed, some independent nations still remained. Then, with precise detail that clearly showed familiarity, she carved 7 islands west of the bay, explaining that this was the archipelago of stars, where each island functioned almost like its own faction, constantly at war with one another, and that it had once been her homeland, though she had left it behind. I almost questioned her about it, especially since she brushed past it so quickly, but I remembered my promise to Valeria and decided it would be unfair to press Rika on something she wasn't ready to share. Instead, I told her she could talk about it whenever she wanted, and suggested we return to the Federation, which immediately triggered a sharp response as she snapped that she wasn't telling me because it wasn't important right now, and that it didn't matter whether I knew or not, even though her flushed cheeks made it obvious there was more beneath the surface. She quickly redirected the conversation, warning me not to interrupt again or she would stop teaching me altogether, and then threw 4 bosu into the ground to mark the remaining regions. She explained that along the northern coast was the Greenmere Kingdom, with Asuhe to the south, Metraku at the center, and Zaxera south of Revia, noting that each kingdom governed itself independently but benefited from free trade within the Federation. Midway through that explanation, she suddenly perked up and muttered that they were getting close, adding that people would think she had lost her edge because of me, which immediately put me on alert. I asked what was going on and whether the others had returned, and she confirmed that they had, along with company, telling me to make myself presentable because the last thing I wanted was to make a bad first impression in front of the royal family. I made my way back inside the mansion, and although no one had arrived yet, I trusted Rika's words enough to know that it wouldn't stay quiet for long. As I stepped further in, my mind immediately shifted to something more practical, because I had no idea what I was supposed to wear in a situation like this. I glanced down at myself, and it didn't take long to realize the problem, since my current and only outfit was riddled with holes from using bloodless. That left me weighing my options, and while it was obvious I needed something new, the bigger issue was where I was supposed to find it on such short notice, because digging through rooms and wearing someone else's clothes felt like crossing a line. Before I could think any further, the sound of horses cut through my thoughts, and when I looked outside, I saw 4 horse-drawn carriages entering the mansion's roundabout driveway. At that point, I let out a quiet sigh and accepted the situation, deciding that I didn't really have a choice anymore and that I would have to search the mansion for something to wear. As I moved through the halls, I could already hear activity on the main floor, with people rushing around and furniture being shifted into place, which only added to the pressure. Eventually, I came across the servants' quarters where neatly kept maid and butler outfits were stored, likely left behind by the previous staff. I paused for a moment, comparing my options, and while the idea of wearing someone else's uniform wasn't ideal, it was still better than walking around in torn clothes. So I settled on a butler outfit, reasoning that at least it was a proper suit. After finding one close enough to my size, I changed quickly, and by the time I finished, the noise downstairs had begun to settle, which meant I couldn't afford to waste any more time. As I made my way down the stairs, I took in the scene around me, noticing maids and guards moving with purpose, but something stood out almost immediately, because they were all women, and their uniforms didn't quite match. Before I could process that further, 3 guards suddenly surrounded me, their hands resting on their weapons as they demanded answers, ordering me to raise my arms and explain who I was and how I got there. I did as they said, lifting my hands while calmly stating that my name was Leon and that I had been here first, even though I knew how weak that sounded. Just as the tension started to build, a familiar voice cut through the situation, and from behind the guards, Rosalind stepped forward and ordered them to stand down, explaining that I was an exception and that they would soon be assigned to guard me as well. The guards stepped aside, and I finally got a clear look at her, which prompted me to welcome her back, while she casually thanked me before immediately questioning why I was dressed as a butler, wondering if Rika had put me to work. I explained that I needed something presentable since the royal family had arrived, but her response made it clear that my definition of presentable was far from adequate, as she informed me that Queen Lysynthia Miriana Revelry, Celestine's mother and the king's first wife, was here. The moment she said that, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, because that wasn't exactly the kind of person I wanted to meet under these circumstances. I tried to reassure myself that I could still make a good impression, but Rosalind immediately shut that down by telling me that the queen already didn't like me. That hit harder than I expected, and the knot in my stomach dropped like a stone, leaving me with a single resigned thought that this was going to be a problem. Before I could dwell on it, Rosalind told me to follow her, and she led me through the corridors until we reached a door where Valeria, Rika, Tala, and Cersei were already waiting. As I approached, I could hear raised voices coming from inside, and when I asked if everything was all right, Cersei explained that things had started off well, but once Celestine mentioned being promised to me, the situation had quickly turned tense. That only made things worse in my mind, because we hadn't even met, yet somehow I had already made a terrible impression. And while part of me wanted to point out that I was the one keeping Celestine alive, I knew that wouldn't exactly win me any favor. Rosalind added that from the queen's perspective, her daughter had been kidnapped, turned into something she shouldn't have been, and was now dependent on me to survive, which meant she likely believed there was a larger conspiracy and that I was part of it. Hearing that, I couldn't help but think that things might already be beyond saving. Rika, on the other hand, simply wished me luck before signaling to the guard inside that I had arrived, and then she quickly instructed me on what to do once I entered, telling me to kneel, keep my gaze down, and formally present myself. A moment later, the guard announced my presence loudly, introducing me as a commoner, and with no time to hesitate, I stepped inside and immediately followed Rika's instructions, dropping to one knee. Before I could even finish my introduction, Celestine interrupted, declaring that I should stand because I was her fiancé, but her mother immediately shut that down, insisting that I remain kneeling as a commoner in the presence of royalty. and even going as far as to accuse me of deception and suggest that I confess so my death could at least be painless. Celestine defended me without hesitation, insisting that I wasn't deceiving anyone and that I was an honorable man who was willing to endure suffering for her sake. But her mother dismissed that, arguing that as a princess, Celestine had no reason to lower herself, and that any such sacrifice should come from duty, not as a claim to marriage. Celestine countered by declaring that she had already given me her first kiss, which in her eyes gave me the right to marry her, but her mother rejected that entirely, comparing it to something trivial and insisting that I was manipulating the situation to secure her hand. She went further, arguing that my restraint was part of a larger deception and that Celestine was too naive to believe that a man who appeared only 2 days ago just happened to be the one person capable of keeping her alive. Celestine stood firm, insisting that it was fate, while her mother dismissed that outright, claiming it was all orchestrated, and for a moment the room fell into a tense silence as the two of them locked eyes. As I watched them, I couldn't help but understand the queen's perspective, because at the end of the day, she was a mother protecting her daughter, even if that also meant she was a queen who had the power to have me tortured and executed. Eventually, she addressed me directly, telling me to stand and take a seat, because she wanted to hear exactly why I had arrived in Jafhe, and how I was able to sustain Celestine without dying. Her voice carried a sharp edge that made the air feel heavier, and as I stood and looked at her properly for the first time, the resemblance between her and Celestine was undeniable, as she looked like a more mature version of her, equally striking in her own way. I took a seat as instructed, but she didn't waste any time, immediately making it clear that this was my last chance to tell the truth, and that if she found any fault in my answers, I would end up wishing for death just to escape what would follow. Anyone could have been forgiven for mistaking Queen Lysynthia Miriana Reverie for nothing more than a trophy wife. And even as I looked at her, I could understand why, because her beauty rivaled Celestine's, and both of them carried an elegance so effortless that it felt almost divine. But even I knew that assumption would be a serious mistake. There was no way a king would tolerate a liability at his side, and Lysynthia was clearly anything but that, because everything about her presence suggested refinement and control, the kind that only came from a life of deliberate preparation. She had been raised as a noble, trained in politics and prayer, in manipulation and performance, in both appearance and deception, and now, with her daughter's future on the line, all of that refinement had sharpened into something far more dangerous. Compared to that, I couldn't help but feel out of place, because the extent of my experience with politics came from watching the evening news, and the closest I had ever come to scheming was finding ways to avoid schoolwork. Still, I reminded myself that I couldn't afford to be intimidated, because this wasn't some grand political battle, and at its core, it was just a mother worrying about her daughter. I steadied myself and explained that I wasn't planning anything underhanded, and that I had come to the city to become a hunter, which was how I met Rika and ended up involved in all of this. She immediately pressed further, demanding specifics about where I had come from before arriving in the capital, making it clear that vague answers wouldn't be tolerated, and that she wanted names, places, and dates. That was exactly the kind of question I had been hoping to avoid, especially after Rika had told me not to reveal anything about being from another world, so I hesitated before admitting that it was private and that I would rather not say. That answer went over about as well as expected, because she responded sharply, making it clear that refusing to speak wasn't an option she was willing to accept. At that point, I couldn't help but mentally complain about Rika's timing, because it would have been helpful if she had at least given me a believable story to work with. Celestine quickly stepped in, protesting on my behalf and pointing out that I was her fiancé and the one keeping her alive. But her mother immediately countered that argument, questioning how someone unwilling to even reveal their origins could be trusted. I tried to clarify that I wasn't against telling her in principle, but that I had been instructed not to share that information, which only made things worse, because from her perspective, that just reinforced the idea that I was hiding something suspicious. Even as I spoke, I could already tell that my explanation wasn't helping, and part of me wondered if staying silent might have been the better option. When she asked who had told me to keep it a secret and why it needed to be hidden, I hesitated again because dragging Rika into this didn't feel right, even if it might have made things easier for me. Before I could say anything more, a fourth voice suddenly cut into the conversation, and Rika appeared from behind my chair, casually pointing out that despite how terrible I was under pressure, I hadn't lied or tried to shift the blame onto her. Her sudden appearance caught everyone off guard, and the two maids beside the queen immediately moved to protect her, only stopping when Lysynthia raised her hand to signal that it wasn't necessary. She reminded Rika that this was a formal meeting, but Rika brushed it off, casually explaining that she had expected me to struggle and had stepped in to help, while also taking the opportunity to criticize the queen's spies for their lack of skill. The maids reacted with visible embarrassment, which made it clear that Rika had seen through them entirely, and I couldn't help but notice how comfortable she seemed in front of the queen, which made me suspect that their relationship was more familiar than it appeared. Rika then moved from behind me and took a seat beside me before casually revealing the truth, stating that I was from another world. That caught me completely off guard, especially after everything she had said earlier about keeping it a secret. She continued by describing me as a natural hero and mentioned that Cariel had brought me here, which might explain why I was otherwise useless aside from not dying. The queen responded by mentioning that the last silence had only brought 4 other humans into this world before, each claiming to be daughters of Cariel and riders of the apocalypse. That only added more confusion to the situation, because I was still trying to process what any of that actually meant. Rika dismissed the concern, pointing out that if I could deceive her, then there was no way the queen or her spies could uncover the truth. And she added that my confusion about even the simplest things made it obvious that I wasn't capable of orchestrating something this elaborate. Celestine turned her attention to me, confirming that I was from another world and that Cariel had sent me to Jaffe, and I explained that the Overseer of Death had introduced himself that way, and had instructed me to find the deadliest person in the Hunters Guild if I wanted to become a hunter. That naturally led to Rika, which tied everything together in a way that seemed to satisfy Celestine, because she turned back to her mother with a look of triumph, and declared that the gods had sent her a hero, someone from another world who could sustain her when she needed it most, insisting that it was fate. I briefly considered correcting her about referring to the overseers as gods, but I quickly decided against it, because that felt like a conversation that could cause more problems than it solved. The queen responded cautiously, stating that while she wasn't fully convinced, she would allow me my freedom for the time being, but she made it clear that I still had no right to marry Celestine. Celestine protested again, accusing her mother of being hostile and refusing to give me a fair chance. But Lysynthia remained firm, stating that while I would be rewarded for helping her daughter, she would not allow Celestine to remain as she was, and that she intended to cure her and find her a suitable husband. Hearing that, I couldn't really blame her, because from her perspective, I represented the circumstances that had led to her daughter's suffering. Still, I decided to speak up, asking if there was any way I could prove that I was worthy while others worked on finding a cure. Before Celestine could stop me, the queen responded by pointing out that as a princess, Celestine could not marry someone of lower standing, and that even considering such a match would require me to reach at least the rank of a duke. Celestine objected immediately, but her mother countered that if I truly wanted to prove myself as a suitor, then I should be willing to meet that standard. Rika leaned in and quietly explained that a duke was the highest noble rank beneath royalty, which only made the challenge seem even more unrealistic. Even so, I asked if it was possible for me to become a duke, and the queen confirmed that it was, explaining that commoners who completed Herculean trials could earn nobility for their descendants, and that reaching the rank of duke would require either multiple lesser trials or one of the greater ones. That raised an immediate question for me, because I didn't understand why the reward would go to my descendants instead of me. Celestine answered that question directly, her gaze fixed on her mother as she explained that it was because no one survived any of the 13 trials. Celestine and Lysynthia stood locked in a silent glare, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on the room, because it was obvious that the queen had set trials so extreme that they were never meant to be completed, but rather to prevent this marriage from ever happening. As I processed what that implied, I realized that these were the kind of trials where the reward was promised to your family because you were never expected to survive them. And that thought sat heavily with me, especially since not dying seemed to be the only thing I had going for me so far. Even so, I found myself stepping forward and stating that if completing one or more of those trials was what it took to be worthy of Celestine, then I would do it, although I wasn't entirely sure if that had been the right thing to say. Neither of them reacted in a way I could easily read, because their expressions seemed to reflect both approval and irritation at the same time, just for entirely different reasons. Rika cut in, pointing out that while what I said sounded bold, I might want to actually understand what the trials were before trying to act like a hero, which was a fair point. So I asked what those trials actually were, and the queen answered directly, listing 3 conditions that I would need to fulfill in order to become a duke and prove myself worthy of proposing marriage. For a moment, I genuinely thought something had gone wrong with whatever was translating for me, because the terms she used sounded unfamiliar, almost like another language entirely. Celestine stepped in and clarified, her tone sharpening as she explained that her mother had essentially told me to either slay the god of darkness, defeat a creature capable of destroying entire kingdoms, or retrieve the crown of Vera from the Empire and restore the Valerian royal family. Hearing that, I immediately dismissed the first option as impossible, and since I had no idea how to approach the third, I focused on the second and asked how strong a catastrophe-level monster actually was. Rika covered her mouth, clearly trying not to laugh, while Celestine and her mother resumed their argument as if my question had barely registered. The queen insisted that regardless of whether I was a hero or not, it should be obvious that I was completely unsuited to be Celestine's husband, while Celestine pushed back firmly, stating that I was her fiancé regardless of the trials. Lysynthia made it clear that neither she nor the king would ever approve of the marriage, and Celestine responded just as firmly that she didn't need their blessing. The tension between them settled into a heavy silence, and for a while, no one spoke, leaving the room in an awkward stillness that felt like it stretched on forever. Eventually, a knock at the door broke that silence, and a maid entered, bowing before informing the queen that dinner would be ready soon and asking if she wished to prepare. Lysynthia ended the discussion there, saying that they would revisit the matter later, but not during dinner, and with that, she stood and left the room, her attendants following closely behind her. The moment the door closed, Celestine grabbed a pillow and threw it at it in frustration, before crossing her arms and slumping back into her seat, clearly upset. I figured I should say something to ease the tension, maybe lighten the mood a little. so I apologized for what had just happened. She brushed it off, saying it was fine and that her mother was just worried about her, although from my perspective, it still felt like a pretty extreme way of showing it. When I pointed out that her mother had essentially told me to go get myself killed, she acknowledged it but also tried to frame it differently, suggesting that things might improve. Celestine didn't agree, insisting that her mother would never change and that everything always had to be her way, and I could see how deeply that frustration ran. I looked to Rika for help, but she simply shrugged, clearly choosing not to get involved, which meant I had to handle this myself. So I told Celestine that I would consider myself incredibly lucky to marry her, and that even if luck alone wasn't enough, I was willing to go through those trials to prove it because to me, she was worth it. That seemed to soften her because she uncrossed her arms, leaned forward, and took my hand in both of hers. Her expression becoming gentler as she told me that while what I said was sweet, I needed to understand that her mother wasn't testing me to see if I was worthy, but was instead trying to get rid of me. Even knowing that, I told her that I would just have to prove her wrong. Rika chimed in at that point, pointing out that this was exactly why she called me a farm boy, because even someone like Rose Thorns couldn't handle a catastrophe-level monster. And while keeping a succubus and a vampire fed was impressive, it didn't mean I stood a chance against something like that. I countered by pointing out that she had said a dragon had a vitality of 32, and that I was already far beyond that, but she clarified that dragons were only considered hazard-level threats, explaining that while they were powerful, they were more about offense, like massive flying creatures capable of turning entire streets into rivers of molten stone. That aligned with what I understood a dragon to be, but it also raised another question, so I asked what hazard level actually meant, and while I was at it, I requested a full explanation of the trials, monster rankings, and anything else I needed to know. Celestine and Rika took turns explaining, with Celestine starting by outlining the hierarchy of nobility, beginning with royalty at the top, followed by Duke, Marquess, Count, Viscount, and Baron. And she added that these ranks had become standardized across the Federation, even though some noble families still resisted the system. Rika followed by explaining monster rankings, listing them from Apocalypse down to Pest, and she pointed out that Nykthos was the only known Apocalypse-level threat, while groups like Rose Thorns could only reliably handle hazard-level enemies, and anything beyond that required multiple elite groups working together. Celestine then went into detail about the trials required for each noble rank, listing specific conditions for Marquess, Count, Viscount, and Baron, each with their own set of challenges. As she continued, I could feel my head starting to spin, because while I had asked for all this information, it was quickly becoming too much to process at once. Trying to focus, I asked which of those trials involved killing a dragon, but Rika explained that none of them did, although if I managed to capture and train one for the Federation, I could earn the rank of Viscount. And that is the whole chapter I could recap for now. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, and if you want more Manhwa recaps like this, subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos. Thank you for watching.